In January of 2000, a traveler visiting Ivory Coast went missing in the jungle. Once it was reported that he had not returned, locals went out and searched for him, but the thick vegetation made it difficult to find one single man. When they finally found the man, he was not himself anymore, showcasing extremely aggressive behavior and a disability to properly speak. The man was the first known victim to be infected with the virus that would later be labeled the zombie virus. Experts suspect that the man was infected with the virus by one of the animals he had direct contact with in the jungle, either by eating its meat or being bitten. When and where exactly the traveler got the virus remains unknown. This incident barely got any news coverage. It was not uncommon for a man to lose his mind and thus got no attention from the rest of the world. In fact, the rest of the world was still enjoying the aftermath of New Year's Eve. With the change of a new millennium and a new century, the people were motivated and government officials from a multitude of countries promised a bright future ahead. The Dutch Prime Minister Wim Kok promised to start focusing on industry to keep the Netherlands with its open ports in Rotterdam, the heart of the world's trading routes. To keep up with the times and to lift things off in the new millennium, the government would invest in the research of thermal efficiency, modern construction tools, and modern software. It would keep the scene attractive and opportune for foreign businesses to deal with. It also promised to delve into securing its networks, as the internet was still a relatively new phenomenon. It would be vital for efficient trading and industry in the future, and having the guarantee of secured networks would favor businesses once more to look into Holland's direction. Throughout every province, factories were established to keep up with the growing industry and create employment opportunities. Military-wise, Holland had not much to fear, and thus invested only a tiny bit into weaponry and supply depots. Then, on the 5th of January 2000, Malaysian investigators reported to the international community that several high-ranking members of the Al-Qaeda networks have met in Kuala Lumpur and possibly discussed future actions. Though this got some news coverage over the next couple of days, the news was seen as too indirect to influence the daily lives of Westerners, and thus was quickly forgotten about in the Western media. Instead, America launched its political program schedule, as both Al Gore and George W. Bush had unleashed their political campaigns for this year's election. Then, at the end of January, the Egypt government had informed the global community that its forces had successfully occupied the contested Halaib Triangle, over which Egypt had a long-standing dispute with its southern neighbor Sudan. The Sudanese military had today admitted that a retreat was ordered, while the Sudanese government confirmed that it would not be dropping claims in the regions which it viewed as rightfully Sudanese. One of the world's oldest border conflicts continued onward as the threat in Ivory Coast still went unnoticed. In Germany, the focus lay on making a stronger overall foreign impression, with the focus set on a restructure of the foreign ministry. Chancellor Gerhard Schröder of the SPD promised closer coalitions and opportunities with neighboring countries to strengthen both. Where Germany's look was outward, America looked inward, as the current Democratic President Bill Clinton focused on the American economy itself. With both political campaigns underway and companies standing in line to invest, Clinton thought it was essential and a perfect time to boost the nation's own financial status. At the same time, the unknown virus was spreading in Ivory Coast. Though numbers were not alarming yet, some of the medical personnel treating the missing man started to show similar signs. The spread mostly occurred in the southern part of Ivory Coast, where the man was taken to be treated. In the northern parts of the country, no sign of any infection had been reported. United Kingdom's Prime Minister Tony Blair's perspective was slightly different than that of most countries. Where most governments were focusing on boosting one's financial situation, Blair thought it was wise to set a focus on the UK's military force. Not as a threat, but to keep up with the dominance of the giant military power known as the US. Blair assured the press he did not see it as an arms race, but just as an insurance to stay at the same level, both as close allies. In March of 2000, the situation in Ivory Coast got dramatically worse. The virus had spread all throughout the south, as more and more people started to show erratic and aggressive behavior. a rise in reports of missing people could be noticed. To make matters worse, some of the infection had spread over to neighboring country Ghana. The fact that the virus traversed borders demanded the majority of news coverage in both countries. But the voices of these countries fell on deaf ears, as shortly after, the world was focused on Russia declaring war on Chechnya. There was no doubt who would win in this conflict with the overwhelming power of the Russian army. The war posed as the head of news articles most of the time, but the people felt at ease enough to still focus on their own country and needs. In March, Dutch Prime Minister Wim Kok offered his next plan of focus on improving the civilian industry even more. In the next couple of weeks, heavy fighting occurred between the Russian Federation and the armies of Chechnya. The battles resulted in a death toll ranging between 25 and 50,000 dead, most of which were civilians in Chechnya. Shortly after, as was completely predictable, the young political upstart Vladimir Putin, acting president since December 31st, 1999, had been confirmed in his office as president of Russia by popular vote. Putin was internationally perceived as little more than a puppet who got to power simply because he was Boris Yeltsin's designed political successor. But his recent unforgiving policy on the Chechen insurgency has already proved him to be more a resolute leader than some of his skeptics may expect. In the UK, Tony Blair continued his road on the focus on the army. Using the Russian war with Chechnya as a reminder of conflict still possible these days, he assured that his intentions were justified. On concerns of the United Kingdom's own economy, Blair answered that this would be his next focus. In France, the mood was quite different, and more similar to that of the Dutch and Germans. Prime Minister Jacques Chirac aimed to focus on civilian buildup, a focus to strengthen and increase the building and expansion of neighborhoods and cities. The cities of France should be attractive to its own civilians living there, not just for companies looking for opportunities. Experts were expecting Chirac to shift its focus on industry in the northern provinces or even overseas in the near future. Australia was only focusing on one thing, getting everything settled for the upcoming Olympic Games. Though of course the coming of the new games created job opportunities and a general boost in economy, it was also essential to guarantee the safety of the people visiting the country for the games. In order to do this, Prime Minister John Howard shifted its focus to naval and army training in case an incident would occur. Where one would think that more African countries would heed the warnings from nearby Ivory Coast, the truth of the matter was that most of them focused on their own problems and conflicts. The ongoing conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea was still a central issue, as well as increasing tensions between different countries on the continent. Since the virus had not spread to their own countries, by some it was merely seen as a new branch of malaria, and a problem that Ghana and Ivory Coast should both deal with and solve themselves. And so the virus kept spreading and spreading, as in May of 2000 the virus had now also spread to neighboring Liberia and even more provinces of Ghana. Because a third country was now infected, smaller human rights groups in Western countries started to pick up on this unfolding event as well. The interesting thing to note was that through all these months the virus had still not spread throughout the northern regions of Ivory Coast, giving some people the comfort and hope that it could be contained. But once again, most of this news got by unnoticed, as the signing of the Algiers Agreement happened shortly after. Eritrea and Ethiopia were at war since 1998, when border disputes between the two countries exploded into military conflict. The war was long, bloody and pointless, with more than 300,000 Ethiopian soldiers meeting more than 150,000 Eritrean forces on the field of battle. Both countries might have suffered as many as 170,000 dead. Ethiopia, generally speaking, achieved military victory, maintaining control over all disputed areas. Eritrea, however, received international support through court arbitration, receiving about 40% of the disputed regions in the subsequent presentation of the conflict to the Permanent Court of Arbitration. The ceasefire was signed soon after and finalized a few months later. The Dutch Prime Minister Wim Kok presented at the end of May its next plan for industrial development. To keep up with the promised industrial focus, its development of new techniques and more efficient ways should not be forgotten. With the increase of commotion in Ghana and neighboring countries concerning the spreading virus, Ghana's president Jerry Rawlings assured the citizens that a solution to the virus would surely be found. Rawlings pointed out the fact that the north of Ivory Coast was still infection-free, implying there might be some hint to an antidote or solution hidden there. Though the issue of the virus was what most citizens in the current active countries were focusing on, most of the world barely seemed to notice it due to its small scale. Tiny articles and footnotes on news channels were dedicated to the virus, but they left it at that. Smaller activist groups did start to assemble to ask the government to be more transparent on the issue and give out information to the people. On the 30th of May 2000, word had gotten out on the retreat of Israeli forces from southern Lebanon. Israel had a partial military presence in the south of Lebanon ever since they supported the Christian militias in the Lebanese civil war in 1982. The Israel military staff had confirmed that Israel completed the retreat from the territory since occupied by them. Lebanese officials had made statements of approval. Then barely a month later, Syria insulted Israel over the Golan deal. After the Israeli government had approached the government of Syria over a possible return of the Golan Heights to Syrian administration, the Syrian government publicly declared that there would be no surrender in front of Israeli Zionists and their evil schemes. The government portrayed the Israeli as Jewish parasites, creating outrage amongst Israeli citizens. Holland continued the industrial development by putting time and effort in the research of gas turbine cogeneration units, but also promised its course made earlier that year of securing its networks by strengthening decryption algorithms. To please those concerned with its military due to the advancements made in the UK, Wim Kok promised the development of new and improved destroyers for the Dutch Royal Navy. Then in the beginning of July, word came out that the virus had spread to even more countries, including Burkina Faso, Sierra Leone, and Togo. In a matter of weeks, the infected countries had changed from 3 to 6. It had been more than half a year since the virus had been discovered. Entire villages in Africa had been evacuated as the people fled. Scientists did note that the virus only spread along the coastline. They explained this by the likely possibility that the various forms of travel, including ships, were to blame. Trade routes along this coastline were altered to assure no spread in the west would occur. The rapid spreading now started to show color within Western countries as some politicians came under fire as the press wanted to know what countermeasures would be taken. The United Nations promised it would start research for a possible antidote and stricter policies to avoid spreading to countries in other continents. However, they pressed the fact that before this could happen, it was urgent to see to the issue the possibility of the virus spreading to larger nearby countries like Algeria, Libya, or Sudan. A spread to countries of that size could have catastrophic consequences. With the issue of the spreading virus in Africa getting some attention, politicians in various countries saw this as an opportunity to push their own agenda without risking doing it in full view. Whether it was Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, who aimed to restore trust in his own system, thereby boosting the Conservative, Social Democrat, and Libertarian parties. Or Prime Minister Tony Blair, who also strengthened his own political power by vitalizing Westminster. He said this was a necessity for the earlier announced plans on focus of economy. In Africa, the mood was quite different. The countermeasures taken by some leaders came to no surprise, as Libya's dictator Muammar al-Gaddafi promised to fight off the spreading of the virus by protecting its borders with violence if need be. A focus on artillery was set in motion, as were similar actions performed by his neighbor president Hosni Mubarak. Rather than artillery, Mubarak would focus on its own army and infantry. Both used the spreading of the virus as a motive, but internationally, it was feared that these were also actions to strengthen their own position even more. In Australia, the issue of the virus was the least of their worries. The games were around the corner, and John Howard prepared the final touches on improving the docks and harbour infrastructure so that the country was ready to receive all incoming tourists. Other countries like Russia and China also did not seem to worry about the virus. The distance between them and the center point of the current infected area was so big that their politicians assumed a solution would have been made before it would reach their borders. Of course, this was not what they outed to the public. Both leaders settled for a focus on industry, with Chinese President Jiang Zemin going down a steady path to strengthen his own political party. In Holland, people started to ask questions that the announced focus on civilian industry should be exchanged for military focus. The reason for this was Tony Blair's break of promise to invest in the economy, but rather going back to a military investment. Blair realized his actions would have consequences in his popularity, but nonetheless continued with the path he began at the beginning of this year. Dutch Prime Minister Wim Kok assured the people of Holland that he and close partner America would keep a sharp eye on Prime Minister Blair's actions from now on. The same negative publicity came to the doorstep of French President Jacques Chirac, who thought that the increase in news of the virus would have the citizens begging for a better military structure. But the people let him know that this was not the answer, and Chirac promised to return to a focus of industrial development after the initial paperwork for the current military improvements had already been signed and executed. Then halfway through August, the officials of the Russian Federation reported that the Russian Navy submarine K-141, designated name Kursk, had sunk in the Barents Sea 75 kilometers from the shoreline of the Kola Peninsula at roughly 11:30 a.m. The Russian Navy had publicly offered several explanations, including a collision or an attack by NATO submarine. The NATO General Secretary had already denied these allegations. The death toll stood at 118, which equaled the entire crew of K-141. Putin realized that before he could return to a focus on improving the country's industry, problems concerning terrorist attacks by Chechen extremists had to be dealt with. He averted to a policy where he appeased Chechnya to stop the attacks and at the same time still strengthen his own political position a tiny bit. In September of 2000, the virus had spread once again, and this time to 3 more countries, namely Guinea, Benin, and Mali, the first of the feared larger countries to be infected. Nigeria in response started a destroyer program to strengthen its navy, implementing strict rules on import, migration, and traffic with the neighboring countries. Nigerian President Goodluck Jonathan used the former published news on most of the spread occurring at the coast as a motive for the destroyers. Skeptics addressed the notion of Mali being infected without even having a coast. Then the world's gaze shifted as the Olympic Games were here and created, according to many, a welcome distraction from the situation in Africa. The 27th Olympic Summer Games of the modern era were held in Sydney from September 15th until October 1st of 2000. 199 nations competed, with the United States and Russia winning most medals. Hosting Australia came in 4th. The Games met global acclaim, with British journalist James Mossop remarking that any future Olympic Games would have to hold up to the standards set in Sydney. The Dutch Prime Minister began to feel pressure as the populace was split into those wanting to make military preparations in response to nearby countries, France and Britain. To appease these people, Wim Kok announced that money would be invested in the development of better artillery pieces. This way he could satisfy those crying for military focus, while still being able to stick to the path of industrial improvement through the form of resource focus. This would eventually lead to a possibility for Holland to start the production of resources themselves instead of relying mostly on the trade. Experts suggested this would greatly increase their position on the market and in political regard. Mid-October, the United States Naval Command reported that the destroyer USS Cole was attacked by the Al-Qaeda network, killing 17 American servicemen. American intelligence reports point to the government of Sudan as a possible supporter of the 2 attackers. This raised questions among the press which enemy to focus on. Was it foreign terrorists who had the reach, thinking power, and resources to perform attacks like this? Or were it the mindless zombies who had nothing but slow minions wobbling about? Politicians knew all too well that the motive of terrorism was a much more believable one to strengthen one's military position, which is what some exactly saw on the route Tony Blair was headed. It was announced that Blair would expand the Air Force in response to the USS Cole bombing. Blair was of the opinion that more security should be established in foreign countries where American and European countries were present. Tabloids and magazines called Tony Blair a warmongering hellraiser. French President Jacques Chirac did indeed come back on his promise to return to industrial development as he started to focus on northern industry. One of Bill Clinton's final moves was to re-establish the continuing support of Israel by America, therefore strengthening the bonds between the 2 countries. With the focus shifting slightly to a military one, Dutch Prime Minister Wim Kok felt it was in place to hire a political advisor, a captain of industry, Cornelis den Hollander, who would see to a more efficient way to build factories, infrastructure, and refineries. Besides this, the announcement was made that more improvements on self-propelled artillery were being researched. And finally, plans for a military force comprising of brigades and regiments from Amsterdam, Den Haag, and Apeldoorn were presented at the Royal Palace. The force would be led by General Nico Geers. November brought news of the zombie virus spreading eastward to Niger and Nigeria, but also Senegal was hit by the disease. But America was not paying any attention to that. For them, it was all about election day and the votes that needed to be counted. It was a spectacular race with an outcome that was too close to call until the very end. There had been reports that Gore had won the initial count, but eventually George W. Bush got away with the win. There were those who believed that the too close to call event was fabricated to keep the US citizens away from the problems in Africa. Algeria was all too aware that they were close to seeing a spread of the zombie virus in their own country. Their office was one of the first talking about strict policies to withhold the zombie virus from spreading. Behind the scenes, a proposal was made to close the borders. This would have drastic political consequences, but could also greatly decrease the chances on the virus being able to spread in Algeria. The issue was that in order for the proposal to work, enough military staff would need to be stationed at the borders. Algeria, at this moment, did not possess that military might. Neighboring Morocco came up with a similar plan, but did not intend to close its borders. Abdelaziz Bouteflika publicly announced that the forces would be stationed at the borders to keep the zombie virus out. Their borders were small compared to countries like Algeria, and therefore, the Moroccan official had every confidence in holding theirs. Gaddafi once again had set a new focus on increasing the army even more, which was to no one's surprise. With President Bush now having the reins, he promised to finish the plan set in motion by former President Bill Clinton on improving the relations with Israel. He promised, however, that after that was dealt with, Bush would set a focus on the military path in response to the zombie virus and increasing threat of terrorists after the reports of the USS Cole bombing. Bush got a lot of support from several states, but there were also plenty who felt uneasy with this military course. In Europe, some countries did not seem to heed the warnings on the zombie virus spreading, as Poland was focusing on improving its own infrastructure. Poland was always behind in terms of industry and manufacturing, and Aleksander Kwasniewski said in order to compete on the market nowadays, improvements needed to be done to Poland's infrastructure first and foremost. At the end of November, word had gotten out that the previously virus-free areas in the north of Ivory Coast had been infected as well. This meant that the initial hypothesis by experts was wrong, and that an antidote or solution could not be found in these regions. The thick jungle probably slowed the spread down, but in the end, it managed to find its way land inward. As the year 2000 drew to a close, Dutch Prime Minister Wim Kok presented an unexpected turn of focus for the coming days. The initial increase in production industrial focus had been laid bare throughout the year, but now Holland would oversee the production of 2 steel factories on Curaçao, one of the islands of the Dutch Antilles. The factories would be producing directly to the Dutch higher-ups, and experts believe this was another push towards a military focus with the increasing threat of the virus spreading in northern Africa. Chancellor Gerhard Schröder of the SPD set in motion a focus on European freedom, strengthening the bonds of its direct neighbors. President George W. Bush backed up his promise as he supported small arms companies. Though this would not make America's army more effective on the short term, it made some of the population feel safer and communicated the notion that Bush stood for safety if the virus were to spread to mainland US. In Britain, Prime Minister Tony Blair greenlit the development of heavy planes. Blair realized if a fight were to break out to stop the zombie virus, that this most likely would not be fought on Britain's shores. It would be long-distance battles, and thus the development of new heavy planes had priority. In Russia, Vladimir Putin set out to form a closer relationship with the in 1989 established Gazprom company. A closer relationship between Russia's government and the company would benefit both. Putin would gain more production of natural gas and oil, and in return, the Gazprom company would have influence in political efforts and the ability to set the gas prices and access to pipelines. And then during the last days of the year, most families forgot about the threat looming in Africa, as they all celebrated Christmas with each other, being thankful for having each other. It came to no surprise that in most African countries, that same feeling was not mutual. Some felt deserted by the Western world, claiming that they only were waiting for an allied country who mattered to be attacked before actually doing something about it. And so 2000 turned into 2001 without any incidents. But 2001 started with the news that the zombie virus had spread more northwest. Pretty much all of the west coast of northern Africa had been infected. The seriousness of the infection of course differed per country, with countries like Ivory Coast and Ghana being much worse than countries like Algeria, where only a small part was infected. Though one might expect most citizens to focus on the issue of the virus, the truth was that to most it felt like a problem far removed from the living room. It dominated the talks at the coffee shops and in the office, but real action did seldom occur. They were more focused on the problems in their own countries. In Holland, a huge progressive rally was organized, highlighting the police brutality sexism, and racism occurring in the country. Though the rally did nothing to change the political landscape in Holland, the Progressive Party did gain a slightly bigger following. Shortly after, a scandal ruled the headlines of the papers as the Dutch airline company KLM was held responsible for contesting airspace at home and abroad. This too was part of Wim Kok's initiative to make Holland the heart of the world's trading routes. Tourism was no exception. Though the scandal received a lot of coverage in the first 2 or 3 days, Wim Kok and his cabinet were sure that the companies could handle this on their own, and with time, the scandal was forgotten about. Turkey, as many other countries, set in motion a path of military production in the form of jet fighters. Prime Minister Mustafa Bülent Ecevit was of the opinion that the zombies would be easy targets in the open desert. Rather than having ground troops fight off the hordes, airstrikes and bombing runs would be most effective to rid themselves of the majority of the zombie problem. In Holland, Wim Kok issued the authorization of the establishment of radar sites on Dutch ground. Currently, these would mostly be focused towards the British, who had greatly been increasing their army at great expense. Over the course of 2000, it turned out that India had set up a huge campaign to create a very competent military. Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee already set this in motion at the beginning of the new millennium, establishing military officer schools, artillery focus, and an increase in army training by threefold. Some question if this was all done in good faith to prepare for the zombie virus, as the world's gaze was hardly focused on Africa during the first half of 2000. At the end of February 2001, Germany pursued the formally announced European policy. After several attempted boycotts from right-wing politicians within the German Bundestag, the consensus of pro-European diplomacy won over in Berlin. German ambassadors informed that EU member states would not have to be afraid of a break in German allegiance, or the flow of profit, for that matter. This resulted in economists and centrist politicians to celebrate the German decision towards Greater Europe cooperation, while national and autonomous circles viewed it as thinly disguised German imperialism. Eurosceptics across Europe already planned to discuss a common strategy to stop possible German expansion plans. The movement of setting up factories in the Dutch Antilles continued, as Prime Minister Wim Kok issued the authorization for the build-up of 2 aluminium factories on Curaçao. To set up plans of a possible military course in case the zombie virus would keep on spreading, Wim Kok also issued a position towards military theorist Pieter van den Briel. With Van den Briel's help, plans could be made to make the Dutch military more combat efficient, thus making them more effective in the field. Chancellor Schröder was now focusing on strengthening Germany's position within Europe by conceding multiple investments in other European countries. After the contracts would have been signed, Germany would have multiple investments in Belgium, Ireland, Portugal, and Luxembourg. Tony Blair finally had started to push his country's economic stimulus. But many people had lost faith in their prime minister and believed this economic stimulus would purely benefit the army effort that Blair helped to build up. Though people believed George W. Bush would continue his focus on weaponry, instead, he began certain steps to befriend America's relationship with Saudi Arabia. Columnists believed the oil they possessed would be an attractive asset to have for America, not only to fend off the zombies, but also to strengthen the country's own position and military might. Some thought it was a response to the aggressive nature shown by British Prime Minister Tony Blair. With these steps set in motion, America's relationship with Iran deterred even further. In Libya, Gaddafi sent forth his armor units towards the areas that were infected. He promised to deal with the spreading in a brutal manner. Those who showed the most simple symptoms of a disease were quarantined, meaning those who were not infected with the zombie virus but showed signs of a cold or a different infection were put in the same area as those who were infected with the zombie virus. In the beginning of March, word had gotten out that amongst others, countries like Tunisia and Gambia had also been infected with the virus. Though the virus had continued its spread throughout the first quarter of 2001, not much had changed compared to last year, as the newly infected countries only concerned a very small population of infected. The repetition of the reports caused viewers of media news to grow a certain fatigue on the subject. This is why, even though not completely disappearing, the media coverage on the subject of the virus slowly started to fade throughout the weeks. China was still completely ignoring any focus regarding the virus and continued its planned infrastructure program in the northern provinces. Australia overall felt very safe from the spreading of the virus, as they were an island of their own and quite far from the virus location. Nevertheless, the majority agreed they would need to stand beside their allies, and thus John Howard started the destroyer program in order to aid those in need from the safety of the sea. President Vladimir Putin thought it would be wise to modernize Russia's army. This would obviously be important for the long run, for if Russia were to be able to stand with potential competitors. The Cold War was still fresh in everyone's mind, and there were even some conspiracy theorists who claimed that Russia was responsible for the creation of the zombie virus. Turkey was very aware that they would be the first to be reached by the disease. Though military acts would seem like logic, Prime Minister Mustafa Bülent Ecevit was of the opinion that foreign policies were of the utmost importance. Seeing as to how many countries the virus had already spread, he was convinced that this was not a force Turkey could handle alone. They would need allies, and as Turkey was in NATO, Ecevit knew all too well that it would be their country that had the possibility to unleash a full-scale war against the zombie infection. In response to the foreign policies claimed by Turkey, Greece agreed to support their neighbors with military force and increase their training. Prime Minister Kostas Simitis said that Greece would stand as one if the virus drew near, but also assured his people that the army training would be beneficial if the virus were to spread to Greece via sea. And so the months went by without much happening in the world. Then in May, the media reported that the virus had now also hit the countries Cameroon and Sudan. Though no one said it, everyone knew what would come next. Egypt lay on the brink of being exposed, and all eyes were pointed towards Mubarak. Several countries in Europe started to speed up their military production, and Holland was one of them. Prime Minister Wim Kok set out to build multiple military factories to start pumping out equipment, vehicles, and ammunition. The authorization of newly trained brigades was greenlit. Military theorist Peter van den Briel recommended the setup of a motorized brigade. Needed equipment and weapons would not be too much to handle, but it did require rubber, of which Holland had no direct access to. Thus, a quick trade agreement with neighboring Germany was set up to supply Holland with rubber. The increased workload out benefited Germany's economic efficiency a tiny bit. British Prime Minister Tony Blair seemed to imitate Gaddafi as he was about to change focus to armor. The excuse used during the focus on heavy planes could not be used here, and several tabloids were afraid that this meant that the politician feared that the virus would spread into Europe within the next year. President George W. Bush also realized that an attack on the NATO country would rally all allies towards hopefully a certain victory on eradicating the virus. To improve these chances even more, Bush announced he had made plans to expand NATO over the coming 2 months. Countries that would join NATO would be Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, and Romania. Though these countries were small on their own, together, Bush claimed, they would be a valid asset to all the countries of NATO.
The recent history of the Baltic States truly is a miracle. You've gained your freedom. You've won your independence. You now join a great alliance. And your miracle goes on.
With the spreading of the zombie virus coming closer to the border zone of Egypt, Mubarak set out to focus on his air force. This would both have the function of aerial coverage of the border, but also combat effectiveness if need be. Unlike Mubarak's neighbor Gaddafi, Mubarak had not been as harsh with threats towards those showing symptoms. Some of the civilians joked that the focus of the air force was so that Mubarak could flee Egypt if the disease hit their country. If the virus would hit Egypt, it would also soon hit Israel. But unlike most northern African countries, Prime Minister Ehud Barak did not move towards a more military approach. He was of the opinion that the conflict with Palestine and tensions with close vicinity countries made it to where their army was at a well-prepared strength. Though Mubarak did not bare his teeth like Gaddafi did, behind the scenes setups were made for countermeasures. The imposing of quarantine was discussed, mostly due to the fact that Egypt would not be able to close its wide borders. A quarantine would have major consequences to population, economy, and politics, but it might be a solution to contain the disease. In Asia, movements were set up to aid the forces of Europe as both Japan and Korea started the push on naval focus. South Korea's President Kim Dae-jung promised that with their newly reiterated naval training focus, they would be useful both as a combat unit but also invaluable to the evacuation process of civilians from northern Africa. Turkey's Prime Minister Mustafa Bülent Ecevit continued the road towards improving their air units. After having completed the jet fighters program, the increase of bomber production was next. Then, in July of 2001, what everyone was afraid of happened. The first infection in Egypt had been noted. The world's eyes were glued to Egypt and Mubarak. The irony is that most of the Western world forgot the fact that the virus had also spread towards Central Africa and therefore was making its way down south. But the selfishness of the Western world and its tiny perspective on the issue resulted in the biggest change yet. Word got out that Ivory Coast was completely overrun. Fighting in Ivory Coast had occurred in several provinces, and though the zombies often were slow, a huge group had gathered in the thick jungles numbering in the millions. That which scientists and geological experts believed to be the weakness of the zombies had resulted in them forming an unstoppable army of hunger and terror. The Pentagon got word that the zombie horde was on the move. It did not travel as one single unit, but instead split up in large sections. In the first week of July, it was reported that the zombie horde had entered Ghana, Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Liberia. All countries pleaded for help. They did not have the military power to deal with this many zombies. President George W. Bush's hands were tied. Almost all Western countries had not foreseen an escalation of this scale. The masses screamed to come to Africa's aid, but the Western leaders said the preparations for an invasion force would take several months, close to half a year. It was not as easy as with terrorists of simply sending a special forces squad, as there was no hierarchy present in the zombie horde. Many countries in Europe said they were going to increase military production, and Holland was one of them. Prime Minister Wim Kok issued another buildup of a military factory to support the production of the motorized divisions. To increase the efficiency, more plans were made to build civilian factories in all of the provinces. The one Prime Minister who was happy and relieved was, to no one's surprise, Prime Minister Tony Blair. How easily moved the emotions of the people could be, as the outbreak of the zombie horde and fear it brought with resulted in Blair's political support growing immensely. Gerhard Schröder of the SPD also could not stay behind and issued a military reform. This would increase Germany's military expertise on all fronts. America's move towards military focus came in the shape of new artillery models. The fact that the zombie moved as a horde meant that they were easily targeted by aircraft, but also, of course, by artillery. Turkey, for a brief moment, halted the focus on their military branch to, instead, secure international alliances to be sure that Turkey would not stand alone if the zombie horde, God forbid, came to their doorstep. Italy's Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi looked to the south to develop a multitude of civilian factories. Like Holland's strategy, Berlusconi hoped to increase the efficiency of their military build by doing this. Just as in Greece, some citizens were afraid of the possibility that the virus would spread to their shores via refugees from northern Africa. This was an issue since the number of refugees seeking asylum in non-infected countries grew every month. In Sudan, it was even so bad that President Omar al-Bashir issued a new notion to tighten security at their docks to keep citizens from fleeing the country. Many Sudanese saw this decision as a death sentence. Vladimir Putin had started a new political campaign after the news of the emergence of the zombie horde came to be. The political campaign was titled Path of the Eagle. The campaign was to let America and the NATO countries know that Russia stood beside them and that they could count on their aid if the decision to go to war with the zombie horde would be made. Communicating with the countries in northern Africa was difficult. Flights to those countries were not possible, and most civilians had left their stations. Satellite imagery showed that the armies of the countries surrounding Ivory Coast did engage with the zombie horde, but there was no telling of how the battles were going. In August, the Pentagon was shown a satellite image that the zombie horde was gaining territory in Liberia and that it would not take long before that country would fall as well. It was decided not to publish this news to the masses, but shortly after, news had gotten out that part of the zombie horde had entered Sierra Leone. This raised questions with the public on how well equipped the African armies were to deal with the situation. Sierra Leone's border was small, and they had mechanized and motorized infantry available. Though it was impossible to push the zombie horde back, the soldiers were confident in at least holding their border area and protecting their civilians. In Holland, the movement towards more civilian factories would benefit with the recruitment of a political advisor. Wim Kok thought Frits Steen, a trusted international banker, would have what it takes to get the production outcome of factories up by at least 10%. Since it was well known that being bitten by a zombie could spread the infection, the Dutch government approved the military's plan to upgrade their body armor. Nevertheless, the armor still had weak spots, as some areas needed to be lighter armored to maintain mobility in case the zombie horde would overrun the military and a retreat would be issued. And then halfway through August, the Pentagon's prediction became true, as Liberia was the first country to fall after Ivory Coast. The threat of the zombie horde was real. They actually had the numbers to wipe out entire countries. Though they were still relatively small now, if they continued to wipe out and infect other countries, their numbers could rise to those rivaling the US, Russia, or China. In the third week of August, a glimpse of positive news was released as Switzerland announced to join the UN. Originally, the Swiss government had refused to join the United Nations after the end of the Second World War, pointing to the country's continued dedication to its own neutrality. Now, after a public referendum on the matter, the Swiss government had announced that the country would move forward to abandon its post as a spectator. By heading through the middle, they arrived earlier at Nigeria's borders than expected, and through a small opening, the zombies managed to find their way into Nigeria as well. Then, on September 20th of 2001, George W. Bush held what might be the most defining speech of the post-9/11 effort yet. He talked about internal and foreign policy and made a declaration of "for us or against us" by exclaiming the following: "Every nation, in every region, now has a decision to make. Either you are with us, or you are with terrorism. From this day forward, any nation that continues to harbor or support terrorism will be regarded by the United States as a hostile regime." By the time the speech was held, Benin had fallen. But it was not just America whose policy had changed. Al-Qaeda had mentioned to plan more attacks not just in America, but Europe as well. The fear that something like the September 11 attacks could happen to any Western country held the citizens in their grip. President Jacques Chirac set out its country's most political focus yet, as with an armament industry, the buildup of military factories could be increased greatly. British Prime Minister Tony Blair assured Bush that America could count on Britain. With the long military path starting back at the beginning of 2000, Britain was more than ready and capable. Holland also responded in the form of a political focus shifting to international policies. Prime Minister Wim Kok told that they would increase the production of motorized vehicles again, especially as the production at the moment could not keep up with the demand of the military setting up their divisions. The increase did push Holland's oil supplies to its limits, and if another increase would occur, new trading plans needed to be made. Germany headed into the same direction as France by strengthening the bond between the two countries. Chancellor Schröder and President Chirac met on several occasions to talk about military necessities for both the terrorist and zombie threat. Europe, in a certain sense, was a bit more sober on the matter regarding the zombies than America was, but then again, it was America's heart that had been struck. After Guinea had fallen, the zombie horde moved further west along the coast. In a way, it mimicked the original route that the virus had traversed back in 2000. Though President George W. Bush realized that the development of weapons was important, the current priority was to bring the country together again. Bush wanted to strengthen the national morale. He, and many other members of his party, knew that though the Americans may be very shaken up first, it would only be a matter of time before they got themselves together, and their resolve would be stronger than ever. For example, the amount of people volunteering for the army rose an astonishing amount. He capitalized on that notion by strengthening his own political power, military power, and stability of the country. In Mali, the same thing occurred as in Benin, where part of the zombie horde cut off large chunks of land. The people on the western part of the country found themselves soon surrounded. Just like with Nigeria, the zombies forced their way into Mauritania with this forward group. Then in the first week of October, Bush informed the US Congress that on October 7th, a military invasion of the Taliban-ruled Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan would begin. The American military attack was to carry the title Operation Enduring Freedom. Due to the military preparation in the months before with the zombie horde in mind, the US was able to conjure an invasion forces quickly. The president also announced his intentions to somehow involve the allied nations in the war effort. The government of Afghanistan had already issued a declaration of protest, but as no major nation on earth actually had political relations with Afghanistan, it was unlikely to have an effect. America had invaded Afghanistan, and the initial assaults were a success for the Americans. Their weaponry and resources were much more advanced than that of the Taliban. Fighting often occurred in the mountains where multiple groups of Taliban could quickly hide if they were overrun. The speed with which America started the invasion was startling to all NATO countries. Many could not keep up, and Dutch Prime Minister Wim Kok issued the advancements of modern support weapons for their troops. In the days following, the Americans had made a huge impact on the war in the western parts of the country, but only moved little by little in the rough mountain terrain. In the third week of October 2001, Mali, one of the biggest countries dealing with the zombie horde, fell, and the undead gained a massive amount of walkers which started to head towards nearby Algeria. But America was mainly focused on Afghanistan, moving their troops in the west up north to hopefully close the gap between the west and east armies. One of the most peculiar occurrences in northern Africa was that the southern half of the small country Togo was able to hold against the zombies, not because they had such a powerful fighting force, but because they were able to set up enough defenses to keep them out. They had the sea at one side, giving them the advantage that they only needed to defend the north. Though direct contact could not be established, many believed President Gnazimbe Eyadema built a giant wall to hold out the zombies. Though many saw this as a sparkle of hope, it was only a matter of time before the increasing amount of walkers would become too much for even the wall to protect them. Another reason why they were able to withstand is that Eyadema authorized incredibly strict rules, handing out gas masks to the ones behind the wall and a requirement of bodies to be burned if they died of sickness, even as little as an old person by a mere cold. Gaddafi had also prematurely closed his borders, but for the moment, this had little to no impact. Just as his armor tactic, the fact that the infection was spreading amongst his people meant it would not solve the problems by keeping the zombies out. They would only buy time before another uprising would start in Libya itself. The zombie horde was ferocious. Though slow, their impressive numbers barged further and further into Nigeria, as well on the western shores of northern Africa. As the war with Afghanistan had reached almost its first month, the American army had gained more ground, but still was not able to liberate the main city of Kabul. But it was only a matter of time before the three main fronts would connect and the city would be taken. The soldiers at the north still had the most trouble. They suffered the most casualties as they were victim to ambushes in the mountains and armor assaults by enemy soldiers. Shortly after, Niger fell too, and the zombies entered the vicinity of Chad and Libya. Due to Gaddafi closing his borders earlier with increased defenses, the zombies had more difficulty getting through, but the horde had increased so much that 100% coverage was not possible. The size of the zombie horde had now reached alarming numbers. Rallies all over the world were held for the Western countries to come to Africa's aid. The truth in the matter was that most politicians were too afraid to make the first move. If a war was unleashed that led to a catastrophic result, it could mean the end of the world. No one wanted to be responsible for that. So the question was, who would dare to make a gamble like this? Canada certainly wasn't. Canadian Prime Minister Jean Chrétien was currently focused on infrastructural concerns, but did authorize a move of armed forces towards the coast if they were called into battle. Chrétien firmly stood by the notion that Canada itself would never be the instigator of conflict. In November, the virus, not the horde, spread to more countries, but once again, mostly south. People were impressed and praised Mubarak that he kept the virus within his country, as experts had predicted a spread towards Israel many weeks before. As it stood, Israel was still free of the virus. Nevertheless, the virus was on their doorstep, with reports of sightings in northern Sinai. The first zone that would be hit by the virus was the Gaza area, that through years of conflict would be a thriving area for the virus to spread. After the earlier actions by Sweden to strengthen their bond with Germany, they continued the international talks, this time with the Baltic States. Because the Baltic States recently joined NATO, experts indeed believed, as with the Germany focus, that Sweden was influencing their political power with NATO without actually being in it. If it was Prime Minister Göran Persson's intent to join NATO eventually, was not yet known. Neighboring Finland also started an economic shift towards strengthening and expanding their Ministry of Defense. There might be a chance that the Scandinavian countries would perform the role of a defending fallback line, and if it would come to this, Prime Minister Paavo Lipponen promised the Finns would be ready. In Afghanistan, the Western and Southern armies had connected, and half the country was in the hands of the Americans. The Northern Army had gained little territory, losing even some on the eastern side. 70% of the US casualties of the war came from that region. The Southern Army now headed east to start surrounding Kabul city. If attacked from 2 or even 3 directions, the city would fall within 3 days. The same attitude as Finland was also held by Ireland. The Irish and British were known not to go along well with each other, but the Irish knew that what would happen to Great Britain would also affect them. Irish Prime Minister Bertie Ahern assured Prime Minister Tony Blair that the Irish would not back down.
Of course, I acknowledged the other day, and acknowledged again today, that the ultimate decision is by the British government on these issues. But I have, needless to say, to state what the position of the Irish government would be, and I think people will understand that.
As the war in Afghanistan roared on with the US claiming more ground every day, the unfortunate news arrived that Togo had fallen. How this happened, whether the wall was breached or an infection spread from within, was not known. Gaddafi's tactics of closing the borders did indeed seem to help, as the zombies were barely able to enter the country. But Nigeria was not so lucky. They received a major hit of the first wave of zombies, and had to pay the price as they rapidly lost more and more terrain with each week. Seeing the bigger countries in northern Africa fall to the zombie horde, the Moroccan Prime Minister Abderrahmane Youssoufy was not as optimistic as his predecessor and pleaded on an issue of international alliances. The Moroccan community had a large presence in Central Europe, and Youssoufy's plea for help might urge some Western politicians to take the first step. Others feared that more drastic measures needed to be taken before someone would have the guts to do something about it. America had made a huge breakthrough in Afghanistan as the Northern Army finally was connected to the Southern and Western forces. The Taliban soldiers in the northern provinces were cut off. They would instead go into hiding, meaning it would still take a long time to find them, but at least the American soldiers in the north had received some backup. But Africa cared little for this, as Nigeria was overrun in an alarming short time. Cameroon was next. Imagery from satellites showed the zombie horde as a cancer eating away at human civilization and what once was. Several countries in Europe had changed their economy law to an early mobilization. Holland was one of them. With this change of law, the construction speed of both military and civilian factories would be increased, therefore also increasing Holland's war effort. Holland's political environment also continued in the predicted international policy direction. With this, technological expertise could be exchanged, giving Holland access to more advanced equipment. Gaddafi's strategy of closing the borders could only work for so long, as the zombies had broken through and now were spreading rapidly across the country. The flat terrain worked in their favor, as they were not obstructed by jungle or mountains. Poland was shifting its focus towards resources, as they realized that the military demand from the unavoidable conflict that was looming on the horizon would require an amount of resources they could not cope with. Therefore, a new strategy and contracts regarding resource gathering and distribution needed to be made. US President George W. Bush set in motion preparations to improve the American soldiers' equipment models. With victory in Afghanistan in sight, it was once again time to shift focus towards the zombies, as well as neighboring Middle Eastern countries with terrorist regimes. Bush felt that a change in equipment would be in its place. But then on the 14th of December 2001, the most drastic change yet occurred. In a final desperate act, the political higher-ups of Mauritania had achieved an emergency acceptance within NATO. This came out of nowhere and shocked the whole world. Now, the Western world would no longer have a choice. It was a contractual obligation for them to come to their allies' aid, of which Mauritania was now one of them. Mauritania had lost too many men already, and its politicians too knew that their country would fall before help would arrive, but they hoped that they would be remembered as the country that had achieved the aid of the Western world. Experts believe that the migration of troops to invade Africa would still take several months, but at least now, they expected America and all other NATO countries to officially declare a state of war against the zombies within the next month. A worldwide war was on the brink of erupting. With Mauritania having joined NATO, experts believe that soon more African countries would join or be allowed entry. It therefore came to a surprise when Libya had received the opportunity to join the Collective Security Treaty Organization, also known as CSTO, therefore contractually obliging Russia to come to Libya's aid. This turn of events was massive. In a matter of days, two of the mightiest countries, America and Russia amongst others, were on the brink of entering the war. The west coast of Senegal, a tragedy unfolded as both local troops, but also close to 1,000 French men, were surrounded by the zombies. They did not have enough vehicles to evacuate overseas, and though help was on the way, it might not arrive on time. Shortly after, Chad had also joined the CSTO, as indeed predicted that more African countries would join the larger united factions. At the end of December 2001, the war in Afghanistan seemed to come to an end. America had made quick progress once the armies were linked up and Kabul was easily taken. There were few Taliban who still resisted, but they were not able to do any significant damage. Soon, a new government would be placed under vision of the American eye. And so Afghanistan was puppeted by the United States. Hamid Karzai was put into interim leadership and the country was allowed into NATO as well. Many believed the reason for this was to keep a watchful eye on neighboring countries with possible terrorist regimes. Due to America's final war days going so swiftly, most soldiers were able to return home by Christmas and spend the holidays with their families and loved ones. It was something the American people were grateful for, as they all knew that soon after, many would be sent out again towards Africa, but for the moment, all was joyous. As the common people were celebrating Christmas, the politicians of the Western world were preparing the next steps into actually declaring war and invading Africa. Many politicians agreed that, even though everyone knew what was coming, declaring war around Christmas and New Year would be demoralizing. Let the common people celebrate while they still can. Let them hold their loved ones one more time. Then, when the new year has begun, is when the world's gaze would shift towards war and bloodshed. Dutch Prime Minister Wim Kok, amongst many other presidents and PMs, accepted America's call to arms to aid in the war against the zombies. Though the acceptance had already been signed on December 28th, many countries would not make it public until the first week of January 2002. In the final days of the year, Cameroon was notified that they had been accepted to NATO as well. And then it was finally New Year's Eve, and 2002 was upon the world. Though 2002 would be the year where the world would go to war against the zombies, it was also the year where a new economic currency would be introduced, namely the euro. Plans for a common European currency had been around since the foundation of the European Union in 1992. 10 years later, the project came to fruition in the form of the euro, guided by the European Central Bank in Frankfurt, Germany. Though giving up national authority over currency might have downsides, the economic benefits of trading with neighboring countries and partners might outweigh them. British, Danish, and Swedish delegations had already voiced concerns and demanded a possibility of an opt-out for their respective country, which is why they refused to participate in the initial digital introduction of the euro in 1999. Now the board was set and the pieces were moving. Though many countries had agreed to America's call to arms, some were not yet in a state of war. America, Britain, France, and Spain were amongst the first, and alongside the Moroccan coast, much activity from these countries' navies could be spotted. But these forces were merely scouts or had the function of evacuating the Moroccan civilians to the nearby Spanish-controlled Canary Islands. Though strict quarantine rules were established, for security reasons, America had positioned an armored division on the islands as well. Merely 3 days into the new year, news came out that the infection now had spread to Palestine. NATO had talks with Israel to prepare defenses to contain the virus within its borders when it reaches their country. with most of the world going to war, containing the virus itself should not be forgotten about. In America, a wave of military migration occurred. From all states, troops were migrated to the East Coast to prepare for the invasion of Africa. The exact perimeters of the invasion operation were not planned yet, and it would still take several months before this would be decided. In the meantime, new recruits were going through rigorous training to prepare for the zombie war. After being sent out to Afghanistan, families, friends, and partners once again had to say goodbye to sons, husbands, and fathers, not knowing if they would return. A war like this had never been fought before, so a feeling of unease ruled the worrying families. At the end of the first week, Japan announced it would join NATO as well. Prime Minister Yoshiro Mori said he was delighted to stand now as allies beside the Western countries in protecting all of mankind. Soon after that, Japan also declared a state of war, noting that Earth had never faced an enemy like this before, but united, they would surely overcome this evil. Though Mori's speech was beloved by many, people in Africa felt that help had come too late. In 2002, of course, new technologies were possible. Dutch Prime Minister Wim Kok issued the authorization of the build of modern heavy equipment to increase the gain of resources that were now more valuable than ever. With this change, the gain in chromium and tungsten would approximately increase by 10%. In Africa, things were looking bleak for Mauritania. Its leaders had already foreseen this, but their country's political system, infrastructure, and army were in shambles. They were cut off, spread out, and undersupplied. Rather than fighting, those remaining held up at camps that they desperately tried to defend against the incoming zombie hordes. The undead had reached Morocco, and quickly started eating their way land inward through the west flank. It was likely that NATO would use the Moroccan harbors to start the invasion and hopefully push the zombies back from the northwest. Some hoped Russia would do the same in Libya. On January 12th, India also joined NATO, as they would be a valuable ally with their focus on military expansion over the last 2 years. Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee felt optimistic in attacking the zombies from the eastern side. If India's help would be required on the west coast, Vajpayee argued that convoy ships would need to be provided by other countries, aiding India's massive amount of troops and vehicles along the sea. An allied invasion of the central coast of Africa was highly unlikely, and countries like Chad would still have to fight this war by themselves for several months. Many knew that they did not have the power to do so. Morocco showed its first signs of crumbling as the country was split in half at the northern shoreline. The zombies started to head northeast, and arguments were made to hasten the allied deployments, not as an attacking force, but as a defensive unit, to prevent Morocco from falling. Not too long after, as expected, Chad fell to the ferociousness of the zombies. As more and more countries declared a state of war, the world's economy shifted towards that of a full-blown war economy. Though still not every NATO country was involved in the war, it had the potential to have 34 countries team up and unite against the zombie horde, and that was not even counting the other factions like CESTO. Though the zombie uprising indeed was a massive tragedy, it managed to achieve something that had never been done before. It united the rest of the world. The war that would later be labeled World War Z was officially upon us. Though China was not involved with the war itself, it would send 2 voluntary divisions towards Holland. To many, it was a mystery why they were doing this. Though the 2 countries were fond trading partners, most were not impressed with the absence shown by China, as it was likely for the divisions to stay in Holland as a defensive unit. But if the zombies would reach Holland's borders at all, this would not be for many more years to come. At the end of January, the zombies entered Tunisia, and in response, Tunisia joined the CSTO. Shortly after, the tragic news arrived that Senegal, its people, and the French division stationed there had fallen. France therefore was now the first Western country with a major loss against the zombie horde. In the capital city they mourned the soldiers who were trapped and had met a slow death. A national mourning was not common during time of war, this would usually come after. But the tragic circumstance of the soldiers already stationed before a state of war was declared gave reason for this. And tragedy was followed by more, as Mauritania now also officially had fallen. Politicians promised that the wishes of Mauritania's leaders would be fulfilled. a memorial monument would be erected to remember the leaders who brought the countries of NATO together in the conflict to stand against the undead horde. They did what so many other, more powerful politicians did not dare to do. Germany, that at that time had accepted the call to arms but was not yet in a state of war, changed this on January 29th, as they announced plans were being made to prepare the migration of troops towards northern Africa. And time was of the essence. Morocco was falling quickly. The zombie force seemed unstoppable. A pushback from Morocco now seemed unlikely. NATO leaders were presented a dilemma as to where to begin the invasion. With these continuing circumstances, it might lead up to an invasion at a harbor already taken over by the zombies. This would complicate things, as once the harbor was liberated, time was needed to get the buildings running again. In Holland, the 2 Chinese divisions had arrived. One of them was an artillery division, and as indeed expected, they were set up as a defensive unit. Holland's military had no say in the matter. More and more people were not impressed with the lack of involvement shown by the Chinese politicians. As fighting would be done in Africa, which was far from the Dutch supply lines, attrition was of a valid concern. A military theorist might have solutions to work around this, or at least decrease the chance of units posted in Africa to fall victim to loss of strength through continuous sustained attack. Prime Minister Wim Kok thought army logistics expert Hendrik van den Bent would be perfect for the job. With the world's political eyes fixed on the war, it was time once again to provide some diversion from the serious matters for the common folk. The increased unity of NATO resulted in a massive amount of tourists heading to America for the 2002 Salt Lake City Olympics. Though it was sport-related, many felt quite patriotic about the games, as it felt like Earth showcased what it could achieve if working together, more so than ever. These were the 19th Olympic Winter Games, and they were held in Salt Lake City, Utah, United States, from February 8th to February 24th of 2002. Salt Lake City's 1995 bid for the 2002 Games clearly defeated all other contestants as they won the bid in the first round. It would mark the 8th time that the US hosted the Olympics. 78 nations took part, with Hong Kong, Nepal, Tajikistan, and Thailand participating in the Winter Games for the first time. The Games were dominated by Norway, Germany, and the hosting United States. Each day, a minute of silence was held to remember the fallen countries by the zombies. Morocco lost more and more ground every day. Help could not arrive early enough. Holland, however, was at the moment mostly focused on its country's election. It was a big year for Holland, as with the new euro, a new prime minister was about to take over from Wim Kok as well. To no one's surprise, the zombie issue took most of the attention during the political campaigns. A number of political parties were reshuffling their leadership. Wim Kok would retire, and for the moment leadership would be given to Wouter Bos from Partij van de Arbeid until the next prime minister would have been definitely decided by the actual election. Gerrit Zalm took over as parliamentary leader of the VVD, Jan-Peter Balkenende would be the Christian Democrat candidate, and Famke Halsema would represent the Progressive Party GroenLinks. Due to the conservative look towards the war with the zombies, many believed that Jan-Peter Balkenende would come out victorious when the elections were finally held. Spain was the first of the Western countries to set foot on Moroccan soil, stationing multiple artillery, armor, and motorized divisions in several Moroccan harbors to the north. Though the Americans had not yet arrived, a multitude of air missions on the zombies were performed by the US Air Force. This mostly was to slow the incoming zombie horde down to station more units in Morocco. Then, on the 24th of February, the first US divisions had reached Morocco. Though morale was high, everyone knew they were not big enough to push the zombies back. The American soldiers mostly helped evacuate more Moroccan civilians and secure the harbor and its vicinity for the incoming horde. Blood was about to be spilled on both sides. With the war in Morocco lingering on, the Moroccan army had taken many casualties. More than 45,000 had been killed and added to the zombie horde that kept ever getting closer to the northern shores. AC-130s were sent out to send imagery of the undead moorland inward. They came in droves of thousands and thousands, clustering in huge numbers in several parts of the desert. It would not take long before the zombies would be hitting the defensive lines set up by the Spanish, Moroccans, and a handful of Chinese volunteers sent out earlier. But then, all of a sudden, word got out that the zombies had broken through in the west, and the Moroccan army had been ordered a full-blown retreat. Except for a small group of remaining soldiers who found themselves surrounded on the western side, the Spanish and Chinese now stood alone. Many thought that with this news the Spanish would be called back to the mainland, but instead, an act of heroism took place as the mechanized Spanish divisions rode out. For death and honor, they faced the horde and actually gained territory back in Casablanca. They soon after met their match as they could not keep up with the increasing number in the horde, but were able to hold their position and keep the gained ground. This would give other countries a bit more room to breathe if they chose to migrate their troops towards Africa via that specific port. The Spanish act of valor, labeled back home as El Viaje Final, the last ride, came at a dear cost, as almost 1,000 Spanish lives were lost in the assault. Many eyes were focused on America and the time it took them to get to Africa. But it was not as simple as sending thousands of troops toward the continent. George W. Bush pointed to the fact that the zombies were also fighting towards the east and south, and that those sides needed help too. With the CSTO being thrown into war as well, Putin launched a new political campaign named Path of the Bear. The bear stood for Russia itself, and that its allies could count on their help. Putin assured the media networks that the modernization of Russia's army efforts earlier would surely pay off. Though the Spanish were able to hold the retaken grounds in Casablanca, help would soon be needed to keep it that way. 2 German divisions had arrived and hastily made their way to the front line. They were ordered to simply support the Spanish and not initiate another attack going land inward. Britain's Prime Minister Tony Blair decided to expand his Home Office. With the increasing threat of the zombies and an increase in support of military action, he thought it was wise to pin his position as political leader to the ground. Though Chinese troops have been sent out to multiple countries, these were mere voluntary forces and the Chinese politicians still refrained from joining. There were signs of an increase of the northern military industry, but some had their doubts if this was meant for the zombie threat. Some believed that China might be so bold as to build an army to attack other countries if it saw an opportunity of their weakened state. Others thought this was merely propaganda and crazy talk. But besides China, the world was also disappointed in Denmark when it found out that Prime Minister Anders Fogh Rasmussen opted to leave NATO in such a desperate time of need. The steps to get this done were performed behind the curtains, but when this scandal saw the light of day, world leaders thought it was a disgrace. Many Danish themselves also voiced their disappointing opinions about their leader, and there were those who chose to volunteer in the German army to be sent out to Africa. The situation at the African defense line seemed to have calmed down. There were still zombies at the gates, but the Spanish and Germans managed to keep it under control. This gave the US Air Force the opportunity again to wipe out the horde bit by bit, but sometimes it felt like the damage they dealt was insignificant. Italy's Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi was in the midst of increasing its bonds with America. The Italian military staff thought that Italy and its smaller islands would be a perfect area to be the base of naval invasions of Africa. Some of the American side had their doubts with this, but Berlusconi hoped to increase the chance of this happening by strengthening the ties with Bush. As the days went by, word got out that part of the zombie horde had moved northeast around the defensive line. Though barricades and defenses were set up here as well, it was not as heavily defended as the area further west. At the moment, they were still able to hold, but the real question was, for how long? With the zombies now having reached the borders of Egypt, Mubarak had decided to join NATO as well, since survival was more important to him than pride. This gave the other countries permission to move troops through Egyptian soil, and countries like India, Germany, and Russia used this opportunity to land their first troops on the northeastern shores of Africa to aid both Egypt and Sudan. In Western Europe, the threat of the zombies could hardly be felt, but nevertheless, it played a dominant role in everyone's daily lives. The Dutch army under lead of Nico Geerts was assigned to prepare military training specifically to combat the zombies. They were the most veteran units they had, and when Holland would be asked to send out its troops, Geerts' soldiers were the first to go. The same military drills occurred in Britain as well, as did a massive migration from the northern part of the country towards the docks and ports in the south. Armor and transport convoys rolled down the roads one last time until being shipped out to war. Though the zombies had reached the Egyptian border, Mubarak had a massive military under his command. Heavily armored troops were stationed across the entire line, confident that they were strong enough to hold until more foreign reinforcements would arrive. Sudan was not so lucky, as the zombies managed to break through, ever so shifting the front line, and creating confusion and panic amongst the military officers stationed there. With convoys borrowed from the neighboring countries, India had increased its migration of troops towards Africa. With their impressive numbers, Vajpayee was confident in their ability of reinforcing the fronts at both northwest and northeast Africa. With the possibility of Dutch troops being sent to Africa in the coming months, the Ministry of Defense thought it would be wise to properly equip their troops with equipment to also fight off the undead at night. The zombies were driven by instinct, and the cover of darkness played no role in their behavior, but for the people of Earth, it worked as a handicap. Shortly after, under pressure from other world leaders, but most of all, his own civilian community, Rasmussen agreed to stay in NATO to fight the zombie threat in Africa. Rasmussen assured the world it could count on Denmark's support, but experts believe that Denmark would not be the first pick due to Rasmussen's earlier actions. At the end of April, after a prolonged rivalry between American and Chinese armament companies to supply the Ethiopian military, the Ethiopian government had granted massive liberties to the Chinese corporations and had signed several military economic treaties with the People's Republic of China. The Secretary of State of the United States of America had already expressed a great amount of regret regarding the Ethiopian decision. Northwest of the Spanish defensive line, another operation by the Spanish was underway to liberate a second harbor city to deploy more units in Africa. Unfortunately for the Spanish, this time they were not as successful, as the urban environments made it difficult to take out the zombies in many numbers at once. With the increasing pressure on the smaller countries in Europe, Holland started to increase the assemblance of brigades to fight alongside Geer's forces. At the moment, there were still enough Dutch people volunteering for the army, but Wouter Bos noted that a change of conscription law might be necessary in the future to yield more troops. The US was doing the same, but instead of changing its own laws, the government launched a massive amount of campaigns to increase the recruitment rate. Collaborations with big brands were established to motivate the populace of America to take up arms and fight for the freedom of Earth. In Russia, Putin increased its focus towards the Navy, as his political campaign Path of the Bear did indeed result in more men signing up, but now they just needed to have the amount of convoys and vehicles to migrate all those troops towards Africa. German Chancellor Schröder started up a bomber program to aid the troops in Africa from the air and to relieve a bit of stress from the US Air Force that was at the moment the dominant force present. Spanish Prime Minister José María Aznar played his cards towards the international alliances. As Spain was seen as the doorway to Northwest Africa, Aznar knew all too well that the other countries would want to use Spain to traverse troops to the front. Some guarantee for Spain's own safety was at its place, Aznar thought. At Ceuta, a division from India had arrived, and together with the Spanish, they prepared for another assault on the nearby city. Then in May, the terrible news arose that the infection had spread to Spain. Though panic ensued in the following 2 or 3 days, it soon came to light that the infection had occurred at the Spanish-held territories in Morocco. Spain's main land was still safe. It did raise questions in ethics, as what to do with the soldiers who were wounded during battle, as they now posed a potential threat for all others. After the first week of May, the elections were held in Holland, and as predicted, the conservative CDA won, and for the next few years, Jan-Peter Balkenende would take the reins of the Dutch government. In Africa, the Indian and Spanish divisions managed to successfully take over Tanger and hold position for now. It gave the troops hope that indeed, with cooperation between multiple countries, victory over the undead could be achieved. Dutch Prime Minister Balkenende's first move was to increase Holland's war effort by ordering the build of more artillery units to aid the troops sent out to Africa. At the moment, Holland was short of supplies. In fact, it would take a long time for them to create the necessary amount needed to equip the current divisions, let alone that Holland did not have enough tungsten to deal with the military order. Balkenende issued a trade agreement with Britain for tungsten, but Balkenende's true intent with the order of the artillery pieces was shown mere days later. Holland had an immense amount of convoys, claiming itself as the heart of the western trading routes. With the need for artillery pieces, it did not take long for neighboring Germany, but also India, to lend-lease Holland artillery units for immediate use. Balkenende assured its cabinet that what occurred with these artillery pieces could also happen with other units. At Tanger, an extra Spanish division arrived to secure and lock down the city even more. The amount of zombies outside the city walls could be contained, but they assumed more were coming from the south. In Libya, that was losing ground at a rapid rate, Egyptian units were sent out to aid at the front line. It was another display of power by Mubarak, who assured the world they could face the zombies at multiple fronts in multiple countries. Balkenende's plan to receive units from other countries using Holland's own convoys worked better than anyone expected. Many countries came to Holland's aid, and his politicians did indeed foresee that different, more powerful Lend-Leases could be made in the future. But for now, and to not look too greedy, they stuck to the artillery units. On the 18th of May 2002, following several reports of successful operations by countries working together, a massive turn of events occurred as the leaders of NATO and CSTO came together to announce the creation of a new faction that would unite the entire world. With the massive expansion of the zombie horde, countries' differences and historical clashes should be momentarily forgotten about, as all of mankind faced a new type of enemy that was not motivated by emotion but pure instinct. George W. Bush announced the creation of the Global Defense Alliance, GDA, which was welcome for any country of Earth. The news was huge. More than 180 countries signed up to join the GDA. The consequences for the countries itself was immense, as they increased multiple aspects in a positive way. Everyone lined up to join. All countries from South America had joined the GDA, meaning they now were involved in World War Z as well. Asia, that had mostly been quiet all this time, had joined, and all countries would now prepare to aid their brothers in defeating the undead menace. Leaders like the Brazilian Cardoso, the Mexican Ceballos, and Russian Putin all stood as equal to the countries that were formerly in NATO. And yes, even North Korea had joined the GDA, with its leader Kim Jong-il stating that differences between its neighboring country would be set aside until the zombie threat had been dealt with. Now, the whole world would go to war. With the newly created Global Defense Alliance, the military higher-ups expected that troops from all different countries would arrive at the shores of northern Africa in the coming weeks and months. The Spanish soldiers deployed around Casablanca made sure to hold the shorelines towards Algeria that gave access to multiple harbors for incoming reinforcements. The majority of the zombie horde had focused on the east and south. Millions of the undead stomped over the Sudanese ground, killing humans left and right. Reinforcing would prove to be a problem at the front, as soldiers needed preparation and training, whereas zombies needed to land one successful bite to have their numbers increase. Over 220,000 zombies had already been put down, but it seemed like the horde was ever endless. Countries like Tunisia and Algeria were amongst the ones with the highest death count of countries currently still active in the war. With the form of the GDA, all countries from Asia would be involved in the battle as well. Many were not combat ready and would need several months to prepare the migration of their troops. But the 2002 FIFA World Cup brought a boost in morale and support from Asia on a global scale. The tourists were welcomed as comrades, and Japan and Korea were seen as valuable allies as well as gracious hosts. Back during the bidding, South Korea and Japan made a common two-country bid and won. More than usual, the common people clustered to their TV screens as the world's camaraderie felt stronger than ever. After Japan got eliminated in the round of 16, only South Korea was left to represent the hosts and made it all the way to the semi-finals after eliminating both Italy and Spain to meet their match in Germany. Germany would then go on to be defeated 0-2 by Brazil, and Brazil thus won its 5th World Cup title. At the same time, more countries were entering the waters near North Africa. One of Russia's fleets lay wait in front of the shores until given the order to disembark the troops. Mubarak, in all of his confidence, proved to having underestimated the zombies as his forces were being pushed back rapidly in Libya. The same situation in Asia also counted for South America. Many countries were not combat ready and needed time to prepare their war machine. Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos promised Colombia would build an army that would make the GDA proud. Time was indeed of the essence, but he expected to have a fighting force ready in the beginning of 2003. Brazil was seen as the battering ram of South America, as its eastern shores lay closest to the African continent. Brazil would be used to deploy the armies of the other South American countries, and President Fernando Cardoso said he welcomed his neighboring countries to travel via Brazil, though he did warn them that their infrastructure was not meant to support that many army convoys at once. For Holland, Balkenende's move to start using artillery pieces in their train divisions continued on bearing fruit as new countries agreed to lend lease to provide the country with necessary equipment. The convoys required for this were not even scratching the surface of the trade capabilities of the Rotterdam harbor. Because this had worked so well, and with the addition of many new countries to the GDA, Balkenende issued the order of light tanks being built for the divisions as well. The Dutch Prime Minister was confident that a similar scenario with the artillery pieces would repeat itself with the light armor. The announcement of the GDA also fueled citizens to sign up for the military, thereby increasing Holland's manpower by almost a tenfold on a voluntary basis alone. Because of this, many divisions could be trained at once, as more higher-ranking military personnel were hired as well. And so, as predicted, the first of the light armor were offered to the small European country. In North Africa, the Russian fleet had begun deploying its men, of which some had already reached the front. A few were sent out eastward to strengthen the roads towards the Algerian harbors. The Russian troops stationed in Libya did not fare so well, as they were pushed back towards the shore more with each passing day. The weeks of fighting in Africa resulted in a worrying report at the end of June. According to data collected by satellite imagery and footage by AC-130s, the zombie horde was estimated at somewhere between 10 and 11 million strong. It was the same equivalent of around 1,000 divisions. The data was disheartening, but mankind would not throw in the towel merely based on data. Though most Western eyes were focused on the northwest and east, the south should not be forgotten about, as the zombies made their way down as well. Not at an alarming rate as in Sudan, but still to a worrying degree. The GDA requested South Africa not to send troops up north, but prepare defensive positions to act as a buffer. They might be the final resistance, and all that would keep the zombie horde in the south from moving towards the northeast to strengthen the main horde even more. The worst case scenario was that the virus would spread within South Africa itself, and President Thabo Mbeki said he would install stricter rules to keep the virus outside their borders. In Europe, most countries were in the stage of war preparation. Poland was building steel factories to keep up with the demand in steel for the increased need. Norway invested in oil, invaluable to many countries and a golden opportunity for Norway itself, as the country was not able to ship units towards Africa as easy as the countries in Central Europe. In Asia, most people's gaze were pointed at China, which had a new president. President Hu Jintao promised to be more active in the war than his predecessor, and used China's strength in number and size to aid the war front. Infrastructure in the country was a major issue, and Jintao requested help from Russia, North and South Korea, and Japan to aid them in developing a decent infrastructure to support the migration of troops. In July, word had gotten out that more of the zombie virus had spread in Spanish-held territory on the North African side. This was problematic, as soldiers from other countries arriving at the area had a chance of being exposed as well. Soon after, a zombie uprising from within Algeria itself crumbled the central front formerly held between Morocco and Libya. Luckily, there were enough soldiers stationed to quickly retake the ground and set up a new front, but it was not as sturdy as it was before. Troops from India and Japan immediately made sure that the connection between the harbors was still intact. The few zombies that were caught in between the troops and the shore should not be too big of a threat, and the soldiers were confident in eliminating them over the coming days. A possible disaster with the loss of Algeria was luckily avoided. But just as before, the GDA troops already stationed there managed to quickly secure the direct area they were at. Some ground had been lost in the north, but nothing to worry about. More troops from other countries started to arrive, and the retaken land felt well secured, and though health checks were a frequent custom, the overall atmosphere was pleasant as morale and confidence were high. In the northeast, it was a different story. Egypt was about to fall, and the few local troops tried to stop the advancing horde together with forces from America and France. With each passing day, the front line shifted several miles back. Some of the officers in the German and Indian army had ordered a full frontal attack, spearheading their way into African territory. They retook an inconceivable amount of land in a matter of days. But the arrogance of the young officers was not appreciated by all, as veteran officers believed this rash move would make it difficult to secure the drastically shifted front line. The German military assured that the front line could be easily secured, as several air bases had been reopened for troops and supplies to be flown in. The remarkable absent country in the war was Britain, who everyone believed would play a major part with Tony Blair's flexing over the last couple of years. Chancellor Gerhard Schröder started the political campaign strengthening the bonds with Britain in the hopes to speed up the deployment of the Brits. In South America, Argentina was expanding its air bases since Brazil was currently focused on their naval dockyards. With Brazil being the base for the naval operations for South American countries, Argentina would provide the aerial route. The French reinforcements that had arrived in former Libya had spread out and joined the Indian forces at the front. They even managed to gain some new territory, though this was hardly noteworthy. As previously stated by the German military higher-ups, the newly shifted front by the Germans could indeed be secured. On the other hand, the push done by India backfired, as they were not able to hold. In October, the defensive forces in Egypt continued to being pushed back, facing defeat after defeat. The front had widened, making it more difficult to hold and increasing the distance covered by the undead. As Italian Prime Minister Berlusconi managed to get the naval bases and dockyards he wished for, the next step would be to provide the necessary infrastructure to support the migration of troops towards those shipping areas. Turkey, who could have its guard down for the past few months due to the invasion occurring in the northwestern part of Africa, was on high alert again, as their politicians were well aware of the setbacks happening on the northeast side. The undead horde would, at this rate, arrive on Israel's doorstep within the next few weeks, and on Turkey's border within the next few months. Internal politics needed to come up with a backup plan. With the massive migration occurring towards Spain, Portugal, and Italy, Turkey might be appointed to defend itself without too much backup. The world war with the zombies had claimed many lives already. Egypt currently stood highest in casualties of countries that were still intact, and America suffered 62,000 deaths within a year. In the northwest, something strange was going on. Though the front line in the south had been successfully secured, a large part of the African landmass to the east had not been retaken nor attempted. Though units from many different countries were stationed here, none were engaging. Some believed High Command only had eye for maneuvering southwards, foolishly ignoring what happened behind their backs. In Holland, the divisions that were rumored to be shipped out for an invasion on the western shores of Africa had all been trained, and current training finance shifted mainly to supplying and upgrading the current soldiers. In the beginning of November, word had gotten out that a similar occurrence like in Tunisia had happened in Sudan as well. History repeated itself once again, as even though the country was lost, the troops currently stationed there, mostly consisting of American and Japanese, were able to hold and secure their current location. In former Libya, a desperate attempt to link up with the Egyptian troops to the east had horribly failed, and in the northwest, the GDA was not gaining as much territory as they were before. The real danger lay to the east, as the zombies had reached the borders of Israel, and the battle that would be labeled as the Clash of Gods and Demons had erupted. This battle had a significance of an entirely different matter. Jerusalem was a city fought for by many religions over the span of thousands of years. But now, all these religions fought side by side to protect the holy place from the undead, which some of the religious soldiers saw as demons brought forth from the underworld. Ethiopia, though having suffered minor losses in both troops and territory, was able to hold on for several weeks without being pushed back too far. As the clash of gods and demons continued for days in Israel and Palestine, Benjamin Netanyahu brought words of courage and holdfast for the troops fearing defeat. The combined power and increase in defensive positions would surely prevail over the undead menace. Almost 100,000 GDA troops were stationed in the region and fighting for their homes. But what Netanyahu left out was that the number of zombies nearing their border had increased by millions. The main fighting force present at the Israeli border were from Israel, Russia, China, and Iraq, as leader Saddam Hussein sent in some of his light tanks to provide support. The zombie threat on unclaimed eastern territory in the northwestern region of Africa that was worrying some of the military personnel had seemed to have disappeared. A few thousand zombies had been encircled by GDA troops, and most of the undead near the shore were driven out. Yet no force was sent out to at least secure the ground. The clash of gods and demons proved to be the bloodiest battle yet. It was utter chaos. With this many zombies incoming, panic could sometimes not even be contained with higher-ranking officers, and missteps were made, as sometimes information was incomplete or air and artillery strikes were called in too close, killing more friendlies than enemies. The defensive bunkers and positions were quickly flooded with the undead, some being sealed to keep them locked in there. In the southern part of Africa, the zombies only managed to advance slowly and sporadically. This was due to the thick jungles they had to traverse. Though the vegetation added both an advantage and disadvantage, it gave the GDA troops room and time to resupply stationed forces or quickly fall back if necessary through small, artificially made paths. As 2002 drew to a close, word had gotten out that Palestine had fallen. Some of the zombies had shifted further north, surpassing Jerusalem. But the real danger lay in a massive group of the Horde, about 2 or 3 million strong, that headed eastward, where less than 50,000 were stationed. If they were able to cross their defensive line, the zombies would head into Saudi Arabia. The worldwide media, of course, did not focus on the losses in Israel, and only focused on minor victories gained over there, and the many victories in former Libya and the northwestern part. Because of this, the worldwide perception was pretty positive, with Operation Alpha Crucis being labeled as a first major success of many to come. Christmas in 2002 was spent by many families in the West and Far East in peace and with good spirits. India managed to strengthen its grip on claimed territories before the end of the year. And thus, 2002 turned in 2003, the year where hopefully more countries would join the front to push the menace back. In Holland, the train divisions took shape with upgraded equipment and vehicles. Tens of thousands of motorized infantry would be accompanied by light tank divisions, which people believed to be the battering rams in the presumed strategy of securing unoccupied land as quickly as possible. When the invasion would take place and if other countries would accompany the invasion was not yet known. The increase in necessary resources resulted in a multiple trade deal with Canada, creating positive outcomes for both countries. And as always, Balkan and the strategy with the land leases continued to be a success. In the northwestern part of Africa, another push by India had started, but the Germans this time were having trouble holding their line. The overall territory retaken by the GDA had a mass that was bigger than several European countries. It proved difficult to hold at some places. The undead had once again entered the area of the eastern shores, but were still being ignored. The front lines were on some places not even defended. Military personnel blamed this at the slow speed of other countries arriving in Africa, meaning they did not have enough troops to fortify all positions. To counter this, Portugal was asked to build more dockyards as well. It was also likely that Portugal would be the base where the invasion force would be sent to, destined for the western shores of Africa. China's Hu Jintao was in the midst of a military reorganization as he vowed to provide an outlook towards the war instead of his predecessor. Though many of the Chinese troops were already involved in the war, the current war situation in China did not steer into a direction of outward conflict. Jintao promised he would change this. Indian leader Atal Vajpayee was proud of his army's accomplishments. Though not all of them were successful, he reiterated the fact that his military path during the last 3 years had bared fruit and that India was the country to retake most of the land. There were even talks amongst the Indian politician to call the newly taken ground New India once the war was over. But daydreaming about the war's end proved still too early, as the zombies did indeed manage to break through to the east and headed into Saudi Arabia. This conflict was no longer solely dedicated to the African continent. Over 1.3 million zombies had already been slaughtered, but it never seemed enough. It was estimated they still had at least 15 million undead. The soldiers stationed at former Libya were stuck. They were not able to push the front further at any side and asked for reinforcements, prioritizing their situation over the current preferred northwest. In Ethiopia, the battle continued as well, with many soldiers from other countries fighting there. Though victories were not gained on the front, it was not as drastic as in Israel, which rumor had was about to fall. In almost a month, the zombies had covered over half of Saudi Arabia, a country that did not prove ready to face such power. Yemen and Iraq both had to deal with them as well, where both countries also proved inapt to deal with the undead. Like a knife through butter, the zombies mowed their way through mortal men. Where many hoped that 2003 would be the year that would bring the turn of the tide, it could as well be the year that showcased the defeat of men itself. Earth was running out of options. With the zombies breaking through to the east and going around the forces in Israel, they were clawing their way through multiple countries at breakneck speed. Many country leaders hoped to slow down the horde with more and more airstrikes and bombing runs. Hu Jintao, who had already sent in many of his troops, was no exception. Besides the horde, the virus itself continued to keep spreading, soon hitting the first countries in Europe. In the south, various countries had fallen due to a zombie uprising from within. Scientists urged the threat of the virus itself being as much of a reason to fail as the physical horde itself. The world was turning desperate. The world was turning scared. There was a divide in what to do next. Some believed that the humans just had to hold out. With each passing year, new and better technological warfare could be constructed, eventually making men so powerful that they could obliterate the zombie threat with ease, since they only consisted of flesh and bone. But there were those who had no faith in waiting, and saw that that very same time was running low. They pressed the importance of using nuclear weapons to wipe out immense parts of the horde. Many members of the GDA were against this, as the land and soil would be turned to wasteland, never to be used by man again for many decades, maybe even centuries. And so men did what men do best. They quarreled amongst themselves as they differed of opinion. Nothing was being done. The front in Africa was stuck, and the many forces stationed in Israel were completely surrounded. They had the docks as an escape route, but many refused and continued to fight on. Every day, the stranded soldiers from countries including Lebanon and remnants of the Egyptian army went from door to door in search for small packs of zombies they could take out. All throughout the day, mortar fire, artillery strikes and tanks could be heard, as resupplying the armies was not an issue due to the proclaimed dockyards. The men lost all sense of time and connection to the rest of the world, where every day survived seemed like a victory, and friendships between strangers from different countries were as easily made as ripped to shreds by the zombies. With the situation being so desperate, the higher-ups in Holland agreed to speed up the planned invasion on the west coast of northern Africa. Though some of the divisions had not been fully stocked yet, they were mostly sent to establish a new front and dockyards for more countries to enter Africa. Michiel van der Laan would take control over the light armor and motorized divisions. And thus, the migration towards the harbors in Spain and Portugal began. Some of the vehicles traveled by road through Belgium and France, while troops were being shipped. They hoped to relieve some of the heat that the soldiers from many different countries were dealing with in Israel. Some of the zombies had reached the border of Turkey as well, but no report of direct contact had been made yet. Turkey's forces stood at the ready. At the end of March, the Dutch soldiers had almost reached the ports of Portugal and Spain. Next up would be the preparation for the invasion, which would also take several days. The situation looked bleak, as the zombies mawed their way through Syria, Iraq, and Kuwait with ease. In the south of Africa, things had calmed down. Some believe the uprising from within the fallen countries had scrambled the hordes that now needed time to regroup before heading deeper southward. Plans for the naval invasion were in progress. The army under lead of Nico Geertz would hit a harbor to the west of the Indian front line. The units would then move north, east, and south to establish a connection with the Indian forces and capture more dockyards. Preparations would take 42 days. Michiel van der Laan would approach Africa from a south position, hopefully being able to establish a connection with Gabon and capture dockyards that were plentiful in the area. Their preparation time would consist of almost half a year, and they would function as a flanking attack maneuver in case Geert's army found itself stuck by a wall of undead. The Middle Eastern countries needed to hold out for a little over a month. Many trusted that they would hold, but some leaders, like Iraqi President Saddam Hussein, had little trust in the invasion of Holland making a big difference. Russian President Vladimir Putin set his focus on ports in the east. It was a long way around to reach Africa this way, but he had spent the previous months so much in the west that not much more could be built there. Germany, trying to be the conductor of Europe's military movements, set its gaze on intercontinental politics as more countries from other continents needed to get into the war faster. President Chirac, like many other leaders, saw an opportunity to improve the air force in hopes to slow down the zombies with bigger and better aircraft. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad had set a focus on dockyards before the attack with the zombies happened. Some believed he might have wanted to build new docks to start evacuating Syrian higher-ups, as he did not believe the war could be won. Others thought these were mere conspiracy theories. Australia, much like Britain, was surprisingly absent from the war. There were even protests in multiple cities to refrain from entering the war, as many citizens felt safe and far from the threat here in Australia. Kim Beazley proposed to recruit more diplomats with a similar state of mind, as Beazley did want to enter the war and take part in the fight that could very well be mankind's last war. In the south of Africa, things had heated up again, as the zombies attacked different fronts after having regrouped. In the north, the first Brazilian troops had arrived, establishing a position with German and Japanese troops. Brazilian President Cardoso assured that many more troops were on the way, and that they were ready to deploy troops when the western invasion by the Dutch would occur as well. Saudi Arabia, to many surprise, had found itself recovering and even regaining some lost ground, as the zombies seemed to have thinned out at the front. Though exact reasons were unknown, some thought they were called towards the bigger hordes to the north. Though losses were taken all over the place, the speed at which the zombies had advanced had drastically depleted. At least the soldiers had managed to get a foothold. And so the weeks went by. The Dutch had settled in for a little over 3 weeks, some being nervous and others being more positive. The areas in the west had almost no zombie activity, making heavy combat an unlikely scenario in the first couple of months. With the war continuing, the bodies kept piling up as well. 2.5 million zombies had already been killed, but they still had 10 times as many that were a threat. America, Russia, and China suffered a combined casualty number of over 500,000. The optimistic spirit of the people back during Christmas had all but disappeared. In the north, more and more Brazilians had arrived and moved the German front a tiny bit south. At the border of Iran, the first skirmishes with the undead had erupted as well. From afar, bouldering artillery rained down hell on the zombies, reducing many of them to dust. And then, on the 25th of April 2003, a nuclear bomb was dropped near Jerusalem with devastating consequences to the land. It decimated a horde of zombies over 150,000 strong. Who authorized the strike was unknown, as communications with the Middle East were scrambled. Some said it was the Russians, others blamed India. The truth in the matter was that though the nuclear strike did take down many zombies, the horde was only slowed down by a small margin. Due to the nuclear fallout, many soldiers had to retreat, whereas the zombies remained unharmed. Some skeptics even implied that the radiation might result in mutations making the zombies stronger or, God forbid, faster. The nuclear attack seemed useless, as the undead menace continued to spread. Politicians were furious, pointing fingers to one another, some demanding more nukes to be dropped. The downfall of mankind would always be, as described by many authors in the past, by his own doing. And then finally, on the 11th of May 2003, the invasion army of Nico Geertz set out to assault the shores in the west. And their invasion came right on time, as the zombies managed to bite their way through a narrow passage deeper into the territories of Iran. It would still take a week before the ships and crew were in position, but then, on the 18th, the Dutch had finally set foot on African soil and managed to get both an airfield and a dockyard back. The claimed land was small in comparison with the others, but at least it gave mankind some long-awaited good news. In the coming weeks, the Dutch would spread out in all directions to get as much land back as they could, prioritizing dockyards and airfields. In the first 10 days, they made good progress, but were surprised that no other country had backed them up yet. Further east, the first of the Dutch troops had encountered some of the zombies and were ordered to halt. At the same time, news got out that the first of the Brazilians had arrived, with the Russians soon to follow. China was waiting in line as well, as the Dutch bravely continued to spread and claim more territory. With the counter-invasion occurring in the west of northern Africa, some of the zombies were indeed diverted to migrate and relieve some pressure in the Middle East. For the first time in weeks, a certain calmness returned to Israel and Lebanon. In the west, the Dutch were currently trying to link up with the Indian front line to secure a pathway for both invasion forces. The moment that the link had been established, both Indian and Chinese troops headed over to help reinforce the western front line, which currently was incredibly wide but poorly defended at some places. In the south, more and more Brazilian troops arrived at the taken dockyards as they helped to clean up the front and aid in the capture of more ports amongst the thick jungle. Though Saudi Arabia seemed to have recovered and preparing for a counterattack, Iraq felt that the pressure was put on them again. They only had a sliver of land remaining before ultimately falling. On the western shores of Africa, more units started to arrive, like Japanese, German, and finally the first of the British were spotted. But the front had come to a stalemate, as all along the line they had encountered undead resistance. It seemed like the plan of the western invasion only worked for a short time. After a month, the zombie horde in the Middle East advanced once more at all locations, and at the end of June, word got out that Iraq indeed had fallen. Saddam Hussein, word had it, got eaten alive as his escaped convoy got overrun by walkers. This meant that part of the horde now shifted towards Turkey, and Ecevit got the war he feared for so many years. Ecevit had more than 500,000 troops at the border, ready to defend the country, but 500,000 was nothing compared to 6 million hungering zombies. Ecevit focused on the improvement of industry in the hopes to resupply and upgrade the front to give the soldiers as much time as possible. Iran's demise did not go as rapidly as Turkey's, mostly because their front line was not as wide. The American-instated Afghan interim leader Hamid Karzai set a focus on bomber production to aid the defense of his neighboring country. In the west of North Africa, a Chinese dominance was established as the troops maneuvered quickly through the open terrain and prevent the zombies from pushing the soldiers back. In the south, it was mostly the Brazilians at the head of the operations. They were used to jungle terrain, and the harbors around that area lay in a convenient position for Brazil to ship reinforcing troops towards. Indian leader Vajpayee seemed worried and prepared steps to secure his political position. Though first embraced by the people for Indians' dominant role in Africa, there was now critique on the ability to defend Indians' own borders if the zombies were to arrive on their own doorstep. After Iran, all that stood between the undead and India was Pakistan. The fight in Turkey was a disaster. The battle turned out to be the bloodiest one yet. In only 2 weeks, tens of thousands of Turkish soldiers had been torn to shreds and were forced to flee deep into their own territory. Though Turkey did receive help from other countries, there was a shocking low number from Europe. A few skeptics were afraid that some European leaders were halting the aid given to others in order to defend their own borders. A foolish decision, as with each fallen country, the zombies only grew stronger. The battles around Jerusalem still continued on. There was no way to relieve the troops. This hell had become a habit for them, and the soldiers stuck there, a few 100,000, got the commonly known nickname, the Lost Souls. With the rate that Turkey was falling, Greece would soon be next. Prime Minister Kostas Simitis had already taken the necessary steps in the preceding weeks and deployed Greek troops to the many islands of the country. For their last months of peace, Simitis tried to strengthen the national unity to boost morale amongst the Greek citizens. Though the zombies were making mincemeat out of the soldiers on both the Iranian and Turkish front, there was another front that should not be forgotten about. A front that was awfully getting close to the border of Russia. It was expected that Putin would lower the priority of foreign help, as it was all but sure that smaller countries like Armenia and Azerbaijan would fall victim to the zombies as well. In the west, the troops managed to push the front line by a great distance. It was ironic that here in northwestern Africa, that was the place for so much death and decay in the years before, now felt like one of the safest and serene places, with only military personnel stationed at several checkpoints. Another harbor had been captured by the Dutch that could then be expanded with the arrival of more Brazilian troops. In Iran, Chinese soldiers had arrived to help, as of course China itself felt the hot breath of the zombie getting closer and closer. In the south of Africa, it was all but quiet. Chinese troops were present here as well, and tried to use the opportunity of silence to push the border of Zambia back north. In the beginning of August 2003, Michiel van der Laan's preparation for the invasion were about a mere week away. The travel route by sea would be long, but they hoped to quickly establish a link with Gabon, which amazed everyone by still holding up. Some experts believed it was due to Gabon only having to defend a small patch of land with the help from several foreign troops, and the presence of heavy tanks used as turrets was also a benefit. Where Gabon flourished, countries like Georgia faltered as they quickly found themselves cornered in a matter of days. While van der Laan's invasion force finally set out from the dockyards of Portugal, Georgia's armies were being pushed even further back, and the Russian mountains could already be seen on the horizon. If Russia would fall, Europe would be a lost cause. Putin's words on a possible invasion of Russia were stir. For many times have people tried to invade Russia, Napoleon, Hitler, but none have ever exceeded in conquering the Russian spirit. That same Russian spirit would also not give in to the undead menace. George W. Bush, who was safe and well in America, suggested a change in army doctrine to make the troops more combat effective. The current strategy obviously did not seem to work. For the longest time, soldiers were trained to aim at the torso, the biggest part of an enemy. These enemies, though, could only be destroyed with headshots, and army generals noticed the trouble many troops were having. In the beginning of September, the news arrived that Israel had fallen. Though their territory officially was lost, there were still soldiers and troops amongst the lost souls who remained their current position. They were so clamped up together that they believed they could still hold out for many months given the possibility of resupplying through the harbors. Holland already had its third army, mainly consisting of motorized units, at the ready to invade as well and secure more ground after such a successful first invasion. General Martin Wijnen took the lead over these forces. The disaster at Turkey continued as they were almost pushed back to their limit. Within the span of a few months, the Turkish lost almost 300,000 units, making them the country with the highest number of casualties yet. The Greeks had started to lose units as well, not only through foreign reinforcing, but now also conflict on their own ground, as the first of the undead were spotted on the nearest islands from Turkey. The Greeks initially succeeded in refraining the zombies from getting a foothold. Iran, to everyone's surprise, received a lot of Russian help, which went against the expectation of Russia issuing a retreat of Russian units to secure its own borders. But a retreat would take time anyway, so Putin believed that the soldiers should be put to good use and give those walkers hell to pay for at whatever front it may. For now, the Russian mountains were still secure. On the 13th of September, van der Laan's forces were ready to disembark and establish a connection. Their arrival hoped to once again relieve some stress from the front at Iran. The link-up with Gabon was successful, and a push northwest was set in motion, as were several pushes due east. On the west, the troops managed to push further, mostly due to a few Chinese divisions, but the aggressive push did make it to where some of the zombies slipped through and were able to make their way westward. All throughout September, Turkey faced loss after loss, and in the second week of October, Istanbul could be seen from the current defense line. Besides Greece, Bulgaria also would have to deal with the zombies once Turkey had fallen. Prime Minister Boyko Borisov knew that Bulgaria did not have the strength to hold, and therefore increased its carrier program to hopefully receive more foreign help from Russia. Germany wanted to establish a more dominant position in Africa as well, as they had part of the front to defend. In France, President Jacques Chirac authorized the build of air bases at locations, including Corsica, to provide the soldiers at the front with more air support and resupplying. Iran seemed like a lost cause, and besides Pakistan and Afghanistan, Turkmenistan also would have to deal with this evil entity. The proud and confident speeches once made by country leaders seemed to have evaporated. President Saparmurat Niyazov said that with the focus on military industry, Turkmenistan would hold. But everyone could hear the tremble in his voice. He, like so many others, knew they were not prepared enough to survive this. At the eastern shore, India had started to gain some territory as well, with China spearheading at the front. While this happened, the battle for Istanbul had begun. Like the previous battles, this one also did not favor men. Though the Turkish were convinced for holding the city for another few weeks, eventually it would fall, like all others before. On the Iranian front, it would seem that Turkmenistan and Afghanistan would be the first to face the undead, as Pakistan's borders were still far out. An attack from Afghanistan's angle should not be underestimated. The combined forces at Gabon made great progress as they were able to continue despite facing head-on confrontation with the zombies. And at the same time, Saudi Arabia had launched its counter-offensive and managed to regain much territory on the left flank. But the brief positivity was soon shattered when word got out that an opening towards Russia had been breached. The tall mountains would make it extremely difficult for the zombies to traverse, but nevertheless, having the zombies invade Russia now seemed a reality. Though much terrain had been gained in the west of Africa, much had been lost as now the zombies moved to a new theater of war. The battle for Europe was about to begin. As World War Z roared on, the line of zombies had reached Afghanistan's border. After having invested in more bombers earlier, Hamid Karzai now urged to build more air bases in order for more airstrikes to be performed. On the border of Russia, chaos continued as the zombies fought east and west, making the opening towards Russia's ground wider with each passing week. In Turkey, that endured great losses over the past months, things finally seemed to have calmed down a bit. Besides sustaining a lot of losses, the Turkish troops were also able to do quite a lot of damage to the undead. The initial battles in Afghanistan were, as expected, harsh, and on several points the zombies advanced. Russia's President Vladimir Putin set in a new focus of a collaboration with China. Putin saw China as invaluable in the battle at the border, and prioritized the migration of Chinese troops through Russia to reinforce. China's Hu Jintao agreed and set in motion the building of better infrastructure to support this migration. In Africa, the link between the West and Central invasion forces had almost been secured. Christmas of that year for the first time was a somber one. There were some who lost hope, many who had lost loved ones, but there were also those who stayed positive. They looked towards the future with the promised better technology in the coming years to drive out the zombies. And not all was bad. Rwanda was able to pierce the zombies' lines, spearheading their way north. And the West Central units were able to link up with Angola and start heading east to secure more land. At the Russian border, the zombies were on their way to start the traversal of the mountains. The only positive thing about this was that it would take the zombies months to traverse the harsh environment, giving Putin and his troops time to prepare. And then the year of 2004 was upon the world, a crucial year which could make or break the further outcome. A year where the first of the improved and promised technological advancements should show its face. Many countries started to utilize modern electrical grids to gain resources more efficiently, and tactical upgrades to both troops, armor, artillery, and more. Turkey started the year with a counteroffensive, where the new year motivated their troops to stand together. In Russia, the spirit of the country of Georgia had all but withered, as the zombies had now a giant opening towards Russia. The worrying part was that Russia did not have many troops of their own at the ready at the mountain border. In Africa, the Indian dominance halted, as many were sent back to the mainland in preparation for the zombie horde. They would still have to go through Pakistan, but many knew that Pakistan did not have the necessary force to oppose a threat. President Muhammad Rafiq Tarar knew this as well. His tactics, however, were to invest in naval combat and slow the zombies down with barrages from the sea. Then halfway through January, in Africa, the first of the Canadians had finally arrived. Not only that, but more British troops had landed as well and headed towards the front lines. In Portugal, the Dutch army led by Martin Bijnen had begun preparations for their invasion of the northern coast of Africa. Preparations would take a little over 50 days. In the Middle East, it was Turkmenistan that suffered the most, as the zombies chewed through their lines like a knife through butter. Afghanistan, though losing territory, was able to hold for now, and Pakistan was pushed back on 2 locations. At the Russian border, more Russian troops had arrived to reinforce, and combat was well underway. Skirmishes were brief, messy, and barely seemed to work effectively, as the rough terrain made it difficult to target them in clustered groups. Turkey, on the other hand, made incredible progress and started to win a lot of territory back. With Canada having begun to send in troops to Africa, Jean Chrétien vowed to build more docks to keep sending in reinforcing units. Turkmenistan had been slaughtered. In less than 2 months, almost the entire country had fallen, meaning Uzbekistan was next. Uzbekistan's president Islam Karimov, like so many others, invested in air bases, a tactic that had proven to have failed over and over again, but mankind, like so many times in the past, refused to listen. Afghanistan and Pakistan did not fare much better either. Turkey's Bülent Ecevit had successfully focused on ground military development that was partially the reason for the successful pushback. Ecevit issued the importance of keeping the pace and put constant pressure on the undead menace. Throughout the months, Turkey had suffered almost 400,000 deaths in the battle, but the ability to push back was a clear message that hope should not be abandoned until one's last breath had been drawn. Bijnen's army successfully had landed in Africa, but the zombies had already spread over the front line in the west and south, meaning it did not take long before they found themselves surrounded as well. With the zombies having reached Europe, a 4th invasion attempt seemed highly unlikely. In Pakistan, the zombies seemed unstoppable. A combined force of Pakistani, Chinese, and Russian heavy tanks got overrun quickly, and the undead moved southeast, closing in on the Indian border. The mass migration of Indian troops that was still underway raised questions if they would make it in time to defend the border. In Turkey, the zombies started to push back. The Turkish troops had stumbled on major numbers again and found their counterattack to be short-lived. Uzbekistan, like Turkmenistan before, also stood no chance, losing almost everything in less than a single month. Kazakhstan was next, and where the previous leaders focused on air doctrines, Kasim Yomar Tokayev set his sights on the ground military. They would go toe-to-toe with the zombies. Tajikistan issued a military focus as well, but it was their first time doing so, meaning their power would most likely be insignificant to slow the zombies down. The speed and ferociousness of the zombies had increased dramatically. They broke through in Russia and were now accessing terrain beyond the mountains, making it easier for them to move. Then in the second week of March, the first of the zombies had breached the Indian border. Still, with no main military defense force in sight, things looked real bleak for India. The citizens were outraged. The once proud nation making such a difference in the battlefields of Africa were now powerless to do something about the undead invader. The irony in the matter was that the regained territory in Africa did not even matter that much anymore to the West, as it was soon their homes that would come under fire. And still to that day, the lost souls continued to fight, not realizing it was all for naught. Blood was spilled day in, day out, but outside their cities was a vast desolate place of death and decay. Russia's front line was massive, and it was difficult to control it evenly on all sides. With the zombies continuing to destroy at such a breakneck pace, China would soon be confronted with the zombies as well, and in Africa, the zombies started to advance on the humans too. Millions of zombies traversed the Russian grounds, leaving behind a barren wasteland where lost scavengers roamed the landscape in search for food and medicine as the world around them slowly died. The Ukraine would be the next European country to meet the wrath of the zombies. Though speeches were once again held, faith had all but faded away. As countries like India started to realize the horrifying truth, the once positive outlook of 2004 and its promised technological improvements turned out to be but a mere fantasy. Besides the Indian troops, now the Chinese were also called back to the mainland to help with the defense of China and Russia. And in Turkey, Istanbul had finally been taken over. With the zombies now traversing over relatively flat terrain again, Putin issued an overwhelming amount of airstrikes on the approaching horde. Neighboring Kazakhstan did not fare so well with the plan going toe-to-toe with the zombies. The onslaught brought on by these undead were just too much to handle for any country, it seemed. Tajikistan, of course, also stood no chance, and by the end of April, the zombies had reached China. The world held its breath. If both China and Russia would fall, the zombies would gain an almost infinite amount of units to their horde. In India, a bunch of troops had arrived from Africa, but they were too few and too disorganized to set up a proper defense front. Hu Jintao wanted to speed up the resupply of troops and units by focusing on the southern Chinese industry. Saudi Arabia was one of the few countries who actually seemed to be able to take back land and maintain to hold it, but the resistance they faced was almost none. Though the first of the zombies had reached China's borders, heavy combat had not broken out yet. It was a waiting game, where more of the horde needed to assemble first in order to push forth as they did in Russia. With most of the Chinese and Indian forces leaving from Africa, the front line was falling in the northwest. In Mongolia, that was thrown to the war as well, instead of focusing on army production, they hoped to increase research for better gear to fight the zombies, as their researchers agreed that numbers would not win this war any longer. Victory would have to come by technological dominance. Though there was still a prominent zombie presence in Central Africa, multiple countries were able to link up to strengthen the front facing the north. Saudi Arabia was able to hold as well, mostly due to help from the Japanese. And even Turkey, though having lost almost all battles, was still holding on by a mere thread. Bangladesh, which also had to fight with the zombies, made the same mistake of investing in air bases, where reality showed that it was already too late for them. In the Ukraine, a multitude of different countries had assembled to slow down the zombies' push to the west. It did not help that they were also moving up north at the same time. On satellite imagery, it became apparent how miserable the situation was when the zombie horde was pointed out in red. It was almost unthinkable that the people of Earth could still save Europe. Though it would still take several months, eventually the line of zombies would reach countries like Finland as well. Paavo Lipponen said Scandinavia was prepared. Where years ago they thought they were going to be the final defensive line, it seemed now that they were one of the first to fight for Europe as well. Neighboring Sweden invested in armor tactics, as they hoped that with improved armor, they could win some territory back. The numbers of zombies on the Greek and Bulgarian border had reached that of madness, but they were just not able to breach through. Here and there, soldiers from Germany, Russia, and other countries fought there too. Near Rostov, there were a handful of divisions that were cornered and tried to escape to Ukrainian territory that had not been overtaken yet. Belarus received help from the US, but had trouble keeping their front line in check as it spread out throughout the north, with each passing week. In China, things were continuing like they were over the last months. Then halfway through December, it became real apparent that Ukraine was about to fall. Christmas of that year, though somber, did gain another meaning for the people of Earth. As many realized that this could be the final Christmas they could spend together, they made sure to hold one another dear and cherish the moment of slight joy that could still be felt. Bangladesh, unfortunately, did not see the dawn of the year 2005. In Russia, an imminent danger became very apparent when satellite images showed that the zombies were close to separating the Russian forces by cutting off two massive pieces of landmass. Mongolia tried to rush to close the gap, but it was unlikely they would be in time. With the increase of refugees to America, George W. Bush set in motion the means to create more jobs in the West. With the increase in work and manpower, hopefully they could balance out the need of supplies being sent over to Europe. As the zombies' main horde stomped forward deeper into China, an American and Chinese division were spared as they stayed concealed but were now stuck in no man's land. And so the world plunged into the year of 2005. New Year's Eve was mostly celebrated by countries that felt safe like the UK, Ireland, Australia, and all countries on the Americas. In the first week of the new year, the zombies still had not reached the coastline to separate the Russian landmass. The Mongolian armies continued to head west. But then, in the second week of January, something very strange occurred. After the amount of zombies did not seem to diminish at any front line, all of a sudden, the zombies left. At the Ukrainian front, the zombies suddenly started to head east along the shore, and in China, they started to head west and leave almost none back at the front doing the fighting. In Africa, the exact same thing occurred, as the zombies all but left. Scientists were perplexed. No one knew what was happening. Around the area of the Lost Souls, the zombie activity increased slightly, but not to alarming numbers. On the Greek and Bulgarian border, that harbored millions of zombies earlier, now only housed a few 100,000, which were not much of a challenge. But then, after losing the main horde out of sight for almost 2 weeks, the bulk had been found again as they were spotted in central Turkey. No one knew why the zombies performed this sudden and drastic retreat and regroup at this location. The cluster of zombies present in Turkey now started to spread out along the coastline and headed towards Greece again. The armies in Africa used the sudden disappearance of the zombies as an opportunity to gain more ground than they achieved over the past year. Unfortunately, other countries did not seize the same opportunity, and it seemed too late as zombie activity along the fronts slowly started to rise again. At least in Russia, the migration of zombies resulted in Mongolia being able to fortify the position and secure the land from being torn in two. In Africa, the push forward was halted as well, but the humans managed to secure a huge territory that they would clean and close up following the next few weeks. George W. Bush started to focus on the military assistance for Saudi Arabia, as that country seemed to be stuck and was still viewed as an invaluable ally due to its oil. And then on the 15th of February, after so many years of fighting, the Lost Souls had their first big loss as the Lebanese side completely fell apart. It would only be a matter of time before the other souls, and many more countries, would crumble as well. As the war into Europe did not go as fast as it did in the Middle East, on the political level some pieces were being moved. Countries like Holland expanded several military corps. As it was more than likely that World War Z would still continue for at least 2 years or more, many politicians thought that an educational reform was in order. Children growing up in this world should be taught about the zombie and its dangers. Besides this, treaties were being created to strengthen the bonds between neighboring countries like Belgium and Germany. With the sudden retreat of the zombies, India managed to win a lot of the land back, but it had lost most of its population and the zombie virus spread rapidly among the few survivors. In northwestern Africa, Dutch troops were in the process of closing up unsecured land as they reached for the east when they saw a golden opportunity. Though in some places the zombies had started to show signs of aggression again, across the Russian border there were entire areas where the humans could push southward. The same counted for the Ukraine that pushed east thanks to the help of many different countries. Seeing as they were on the brink of being wiped out mere months ago, a set resource focus was of the utmost importance to get the gears of the country moving again. It seemed that a majority of the zombies had run down the Lost Souls, who were no more. The heroics and fighting would not be forgotten about by the rest of the world. The Ukrainian push was halted as the zombies started to spread out again, with the Lost Souls being now wiped out. But the real heroics were shown by the Greeks and Bulgarians, who not only managed to hold their land, but were now pushing the zombies back in the name of Turkey. The war would need the input of all European countries. Chancellor Schröder aimed for a closer cooperation between the countries, as the slowed down horde did seem to boost morale. In Africa, almost all unsecured land had been checked except for a small area alongside the coast. Rwanda managed to bounce back from their shattered spearhead assault earlier. In India, Vajpayee pleaded for foreign help. At this moment, their military might was nothing. Their infrastructure was nothing. In fact, their population was almost nothing. India had turned to a desolate and disease-ridden plague land. In Turkey, an army not only led by the Greeks and Bulgarians, but many others too, was pushing the massive horde of the zombies back towards Istanbul. Some were even so hopeful to think that the city would be retaken in the next coming weeks. The Russians and Ukrainians were trying to get rid of the zombies along the border of Belarus. If they could connect the Ukrainian and Russian territories again, it would make the defense a lot easier. Now that it felt that the humans could start putting pressure on the enemy, Putin returned to the familiar path of death from above. Though in China, a small group of zombies was able to push past the front, reinforcing troops could easily handle the situation and get rid of them. In Africa, the one area that had not been secured yet housed several zombies that made their way through the thick jungle and spread out along the coast. But just as in China, though the undead managed to gain some ground, it would not take long before they would be rooted out by the combined forces. The amount of zombies that were stuck in Istanbul was multiple millions. Nevertheless, with swiftness and finesse, the European armies swept the streets clean and moved further a couple of miles every day. Though the Ukraine managed to push back, the area around Sevastopol had fallen, as this lay in a position that was more difficult to defend once the undead had sunk their teeth into it. As part of the armies in Africa took care of the expanding zombies at the coast, the rest pushed north, with Rwanda gaining more territory over time. With the speed that they were advancing, zombies got surrounded in small pockets but were not posing a real threat. The Russian front moved slowly south, relieving some pressure from countries like Finland that were preparing for war in the previous months. In China, the zombies that headed past the front had been taken care of, and the forces appointed to the task returned to the line as well to continue the advance. Experts believe that at this point in time, the zombie horde was around 40 million strong, with the GDA being responsible for the death of over 14 million already. Especially the battles fought around the Greek and Bulgarian border took part in this number. Another pocket of zombies was surpassed in Africa, but the German forces surrounding it would soon close it. It did show a sign of recklessness with the breakneck speed at which the armies were progressing. The front line in Europe and Asia was ridiculous in its length and size. There were multiple areas where the GDA lost clashes, and then there were those where they won. It was difficult to tell if the front line made progress in the short term. As expected, in Africa, the unsecured area had been surrounded and now needed to be rooted out at the stem. With those zombies being taken care of, all of the GDA troops at that location moved northeast to reinforce. Istanbul had been liberated and retaken, ensuing a massive victory for the GDA. But of course the troops did not stop there, as now the rest of Turkey needed to be liberated as well. In Africa, it became apparent that the rushing maneuvers of the armies were because they wanted to connect Saudi Arabia and Rwanda in the north. If Africa could entirely be secured, all the focus would shift towards fighting in the Middle East again, giving the UN troops a good advantage. But then in the beginning of August of 2005, word got out that India had fallen. Even though they managed to get a lot of land back, the virus had spread throughout the land, killing the majority of its population and government. The soldiers that were still stuck in other parts of the world were combined with armies from other nations. Because of this, initially the GDA lost a huge amount of land in several parts of Africa. But as most of these parts were zombie-free, they should be able to be secured fairly easily. With India gone, it could create an opening for the zombies to attack from a different angle, but at the same time could also be an opportunity for China to flank as well. China also managed to secure a small dock in northwest Africa to start expanding from there. The assault in Turkey had stumbled, as the northern part of the line exceeded the south by quite a bit. Spanish, Chinese, and Dutch troops all zigzagged their way through Africa, claiming lost Indian territory for themselves. Europe, at that moment, was mostly focused on building an infrastructure able enough to support the migration of Central European units to the east. With new claims on African soil, some of the dominant forces in the area became Holland, Rwanda, and Mozambique. Instead of moving south towards India from their own line, China sent a naval force to secure parts of the southern territories. The front line in Turkey evened itself out, and with the Greeks at the wheel, they mowed their way through zombies and reclaimed land for neighboring Turkey. Russia and the Ukraine had tightened the area in front of Belarus, making sure they were the dominant forces during the pushback. The thick forest made it not as quick as it went in Turkey, but nevertheless, there was movement in the line being pushed east. But a month later, a lot more zombies had grouped up in the Turkish region, pushing the Greeks back by a huge amount, giving them the first row of defeats in the last couple of days. China made great headway in the Indian territories, as they barely stumbled upon any zombie resistance. Aside from another few areas around the coast, Africa had almost completely been resecured. What looked so glooming a mere year before now had turned into a ray of hope. It would create a whole new bulk of political issues if the war against the zombies was won, but until that time came, no one asked questions. At both the Ukrainian and Russian front, there were areas where the zombies sometimes managed to break through. The advantage that the Ukraine had was that the other countries from Central Europe were always in pursuit to reinforce and close the gap. Christmas of 2005 finally returned to a joyful event for many in Europe. Where so many were afraid it would fall the year before, now many felt this was the turn of the tide. With new advancements in 2006 planned, like new tanks, artillery, planes, and more, surely they would push the zombies back. It even made people feel at ease when some governments, like the American one, refrained for a while from a military focus and instead tackled the economy for a more efficient resource gain. Where some people thought that Europe would not see the dawn of 2006, it was a relief to many to start off the new year full of life and motivation. Word got around that scientists were on the brink of creating an antidote for the virus, meaning that though the war would still continue, that at least no more countries and people could get infected. The Chinese and Mongolian scientists were mostly to thank for this, as their first tests proved hopeful. China's forces would connect to take an Indian territory with the main area in the next coming weeks. In the last half year, the human population lost 1.5 million men in the fight with the undead, but were able to kill a massive amount of 5 million zombies. It was estimated that another 20 million or so needed to be taken down before the war would be won. Rwanda and Saudi Arabia managed to connect, thereby securing Africa once more. Now the fight would move towards the north and east, and it did not take long before Jerusalem and more territories that were held for so long by the lost souls were reclaimed as well. The front at the Middle East would soon push towards Europe and Central Asia as well, making it difficult to hold, and therefore a focus was set on just securing the line for the moment. Country leaders that were directly engaged in warfare with the undead continued their focuses on military modernization, while countries on other continents, far from the danger, now felt secure enough to start looking inward again to deal with the country itself. Kostas Simitis of Greece could not be prouder of his troops showing the world the Greek spirit. With the few setbacks over the past months, it was important now that Greece did keep a stable availability of resources for its war machine. And so the world continued. With a new united front at the Middle East, combat continued the same as it did for the past several months. In Europe, the troops fought in the dense and snowy forests, and in China, the connection between former India had finally been made. In Turkey, the rumbling confrontation with the zombies waited on as human spirits were high. 20 million zombies still stood between the armies at all the different fronts. It would still be one hell of a bloody fight to get rid of those. But the GDA and its people were now more confident than ever that they would come out victorious. As the year of 2006 was well underway, the distance between the three fronts kept getting closer and closer. There was zombie resistance across the entire Middle Eastern line, except on the left flank, where hopefully a push could be made. Newly appointed Canadian leader Stockwell Day vowed to have Canada be more involved in the war than his predecessor, mimicking the words of the Chinese Hu Jintao. In the Middle East, the push towards the Turkish front seemed a success. When word got out that a move was made along the coast, several troops at the Turkish side rushed towards them to connect the two fronts into one. With this now having turned to one front line, the humans only needed to secure two lines, of which one still had a worrying length. Massive migrations of regular troops and convoys of mechanized, motorized, and armored divisions made their way through Turkish land to strengthen the push to the northeast. At the Russian side, the push did not happen as fluently as it did in China. Russia lost a lot of troops in the battles before, and could not keep up with some neighboring countries who do not have to face off that much. Though in the Ukraine things looked good as well, a flanking horde of zombies took some of the troops by surprise and attacked from behind their own lines. As positivity returned to the minds of many, economic opportunities were approached as well, such as Britain, who wished to discuss trade investments with the Dutch. Though the flanking maneuver by the zombies in the Ukraine was no reason for alarm yet, the amount of zombies in that area was quite large. Italy's Deputy Prime Minister Massimo D'Alema set forth a carrier program to transport more Italian troops to the front. Up until now, Italy mostly functioned as the starting place for units being shipped to Africa, but now they were ready to do their own part in the fighting as well. With the Middle Eastern front line turning into one, it meant a stronger push towards Europe and Central Asia. The few pockets of zombies that were still left in Turkey would be taken care of by reinforcing troops from Europe. The attack behind the lines of the Ukraine now posed a threat, as the southern side of the front could be cut off. Not only that, the horde could also alter to the west and attack Romania that at that moment was not combat ready for such a sudden attack. With the unfolding events, China's power rose immensely. Their units were active at all fronts in all countries. With Turkey now being rebuilt after it was retaken, Ecevit noted that one of the first things that needed to be done was to get its infrastructure running again, not only for military purposes, but also the civilians who had to adjust to regular life again. In the Ukraine, both worst-case scenarios seemed to occur. The zombies moved both east and west, threatening to destroy the line in the east and heading to the neighboring country to the west. This news came very sudden, as some of the countries in the close vicinity had their focus set on winning their own independence, like Montenegro. Almost 3 million more zombies were killed during the past few months, whereas the humans only lost a small percentage comparable to before. The armies of the GDA started putting pressure on the flanking zombies in the Ukraine that met with good initial results. Since spirits were high again amongst men, in 2006 the FIFA World Cup was held in Germany. France quickly showed itself to be a hot favorite for the title after eliminating Spain and then the reigning world champion Brazil, followed by Portugal, making their way into the finals. France, however, met its superior in Italy, which had defeated Australia, Ukraine, and the German hosts. The most famous scene of the World Cup was French legend Zinedine Zidane headbutting an Italian player during the final and getting sent off, ending a great career on a very low note. Even though the battle at the western side of the flanking undead was in the favor of the humans, nevertheless did the politicians of Romania agree to recruit more administrators to deal with the possible clash in their country. Bush continued his streak of strengthening bonds with major European countries, and in the following weeks, when the zombies almost seemed to break through in the Ukraine, they were definitely halted and the push back south could commence. In Russia, an American division got a bit overzealous and found themselves stuck and surrounded by the zombies. Though the number of zombies wasn't that high, it would be enough to destroy them if help would not arrive. At the end of July, the zombies had been routed back towards the south and calmness returned among the citizens of the neighboring countries. Some of the undead seemed to head towards the Turkish front, meaning complications might soon arise there. And in the second week of August, the only zombies that still posed a threat on the mainland were completely surrounded, soon to be pulverized and forgotten about. A few of the Dutch troops under the lead of Nico Geertz were sent towards China to aid in the push to the west. There were multiple openings at the front which were ideal to push the line just a few miles into the right direction. With Russia being not as capable to push back as some other countries, some politicians felt that the citizens' faith in its own country was wavering. Putin set forth motions to put up a propaganda program to ensure the faith would be kept at all costs. The bulk of the horde that flanked the Ukraine had now reached the Turkish front. Though initially the soldiers seemed to hold, more and more zombies arrived. Sevastopol had been taken back by the Polish and now set up strong defensive bunker positions towards the east to hold the zombies off at the choke point. It did not take long before losses were being felt along the Turkish side. It wasn't as bad yet that they were being forced back, but there definitely was no progress to be made. The Dutch and Chinese managed to slowly and unconventionally work their way closer towards Turkey, when all of a sudden, a nuclear bomb was dropped almost on top of the front line itself. The effects of the bomb were devastating to the zombies. There were close to 27.5 million losses. Though it did not solve the problem across the whole front, it did relieve some stress of the troops stationed in the north, even though they could now not proceed east due to the fallout. On October 29th, another bomb was dropped at the Chinese side. In roughly a month, more than 3 million zombies had been killed. It seemed like the GDA no longer was too worried about conserving its land and soil, as they now thought it would be more important to rid themselves of the zombies to start anew. A few days before Christmas, one more bomb was dropped, destroying everything in its wake. The news of the devastating damage came as a blessing to many who celebrated Christmas with high hopes, and sometimes favoring the humans. It seemed like a never-ending cycle. Many countries, including Greece, focused on research expansion capabilities. Some believed this was so that more countries could achieve nuclear weaponry. Others still simply stood by the continuous air production to keep constant pressure on the undead walkers. Obama set forth to increase production of resources that were required for armor and vehicles. This created job opportunities in the US as well. The Russian line had been pushed past Sevastopol again, getting dangerously close to unleash another war with the Ukraine. And in Turkey, the familiar sight of the zombies pushing land inward repeated itself. All the progress that was made over the past few months was wiped clean in a matter of days. Chances were high that the humans could push back again at a certain point with reinforcements. But would the same cycle repeat a third time? This suddenly made something very frightening apparent to the people of Earth. Though the zombies were not strong enough to take over the Earth anymore, the human armies might not be strong enough to kill the zombies off. Obama promised change, so only time would tell if he could keep that promise. At the end of March 2009, the battles and front lines with the undead continued to bounce back and forth. The former city of Rostov was laid to ash by another nuclear bomb in the hopes to slow the zombies down to the point where the humans could start pushing again. Saudi Arabia was driven back as well, their soldiers falling to the ferociousness of the zombie. The undead had pushed the Chinese and Russians beyond the water, giving them the opportunity to strengthen their front side of the horde. Help from other countries arrived at the Saudi Arabian front, but the country was wavering. It would not last long if this same pace was kept. But the fact was that all sides were losing, and the Chinese that were able to do so much damage a few months back now were being forced eastward back to their main country. Turkey, that at this moment did not have the manpower to put up a fight, desperately continued to improve its infrastructure for all the foreign troops to traverse. President Obama started the program to prioritize trade deals with China, providing hopefully the necessary firepower to stop the zombie threat, at least in Asia. The line in Saudi Arabia continued to be strengthened, but it was still not looking good for the country. In response to the pushback, the Chinese Hu Jintao issued a focus on command to initialize a zero tolerance for retreat. Some believe that this decision was made too late and it would not make a difference. As it now became the custom for the two forces to push in a tug-of-war fashion, the Russian front now started to move south again. Some believe this to be due to the nukes dropped near the Russian border, but others discarded this notion, as the zombies were able to push all the way north again despite all of the nukes dropped in the Middle East. A disturbance among Russian civilians kept growing, as they no longer felt safe as the war went on for years without an end in sight. In response, Putin took countermeasures to silence these people. As it was almost 10 years since the virus had been discovered, there was an entire generation who grew up with the existence of the zombie threat being their only known reality. More and more countries focused on an education reform to properly prepare these children for the undead, but also the necessary knowledge of how things were before. Another pocket of zombies near the coast were bypassed, but this time the humans did have the necessary units to lay these undead to waste. The slain zombies' numbers kept rising and rising as it now stood at an almost unbelievable number of 67 million. And then, the tragic news arrived that Saudi Arabia had fallen. With the country falling apart once again, the soldiers stationed there had the opportunity to win some ground for their own. One of the countries that profited from this was the US, and Obama thought it needed priority, as the area gave access to a large supply of oil that would be very valuable in American hands. Other countries that profited from this were Brazil, Yemen, and Oman. Turkey's strategy of improving its infrastructure failed, as they were also pushed towards the coast at a rapid tempo. In former Saudi Arabia, the new borders had been defined, and now the countries could start their assault again on the undead to push upward. But America did not have such a secured position as they thought, as they took losses within the first months of establishment. The Russian troops managed to get past their border mountains fairly easy, and now started to head west to link up with Turkey. At the beginning of November, the link could almost be made. The very narrow line near the sea created a choke point for the many units from all different countries. Most could only sit and wait until word came out that the units were able to find an opening to start pushing again. It seemed now that the main bulk of the horde was moving towards Asia, as the area in the Middle East shrank and expanded in Central Asia. China could not hold without more help from Russia and other Asian countries. They were afraid the zombies might encircle the troops to the west as a flanking maneuver. Newly elected Polish leader Marian Krzyzewski initiated new recruitment strategies, as Poland had sent many men towards the front in their death. Morale was faltering, and though there were still those who volunteered to defend their home, the politicians believed more souls could be gained if changes were made. As Brazil was one of the countries who gained control of part of former Saudi Arabia, the leader Cardoso issued a focus on infrastructure in the newly gained territories to sustain and hold the position. The Brazilians were right at the front, meaning they would take the hardest hits as the undead tried to bite back. In the beginning of 2010, a change in Dutch leadership occurred once again. This time, the Libertarian Party VVD got the most votes and politician Mark Rutte took the helm as Dutch Prime Minister. Though his predecessor Balkenende enjoyed a great start in his political career, he lost the trust of many, as the Dutch believed he looked too much towards Africa instead of the Dutch homeland. Rutte promised he would focus more on attending to the Dutch themselves, but did issue the importance of creating factories in the gained territories in Northern Africa. Everything seemed to go real smooth at the combined Brazilian, Russian, and Turkish line. They were now starting to push east. Obama continued his focus on Asia as well, as these countries were now at the highest risk. New trade deals with North Korea needed to be established, which were complicated due to the many sanctions it received before being called into the GDA. China needed all the help it could get. It was losing both at the east and west front, meaning that if they could not hold, the zombies soon would become the Ukraine's problem again. And indeed, around the end of October of 2010, the zombies headed straight for the Ukrainian border. The area controlled by the zombies was expanding once more, but now in the form of a rebound, where it first pushed towards the right and now bounced back left with a vengeance. With the horde headed straight for Europe again, many countries, including France, but also Britain, invested in new forms of research to prepare and fight off the zombies more effectively. Russia was not prepared to fight in the Ukrainian front again. Though they gained much territory over the past months, they were still in the process of recovering and repairing the damage that the war brought to them on their own soil. But pity was not what they received. As the zombies barged their way westward, Russia called the troops of the combined Turkish side back to the north. In the Middle East, an expeditionary force of Dutch paratroopers was given green light to be dropped behind the zombie lines. Though the soldiers were not that many, they mostly were sent out for information at the center. As some had already feared, there were zombies everywhere, and the soldiers were soon surrounded, left to their fate to be eaten. Though the paratroopers did die quickly, it was not all in vain, as the GDA once again pressured the issue of importance of dropping the nukes both at the fronts and deep into enemy territory. And their territory had expanded greatly. It was headed in all directions, and soldiers headed back to their homeland to fend for their own. The Chinese were losing, but the most damage was done at the coast. The zombies were about to head into lands of former India, giving them an extra angle to flank the Chinese troops. And then on March 11th of 2011, Japan was hit by the Tohoku earthquake. The earthquake and the subsequent tsunami severely damaged the nuclear power reactor Fukushima Daiichi, which suffered a faulty emergency shutdown and then went on to losing 3 of its 4 main units to nuclear meltdowns. It was the greatest nuclear disaster in history, only matched by the 1996 Chernobyl incident. The damage done by the earthquake was immense, and Japan's government issued a callback for many of its troops in order to help with repairs and civilian aid. The zombies in Europe were spreading out fast. Not only were they headed once again towards the Ukraine, but Belarus once more seemed to fall victim to the clenching jaws of the undead. Bunkers of previous conflicts still stood, hopefully providing the troops with sturdy protection to break the undead attackers' push. By May of 2011, almost 100 million zombies had been killed, 3 times the amount of human soldiers that had been lost in the same war. All across the Ukraine, fights broke out again, and at all sides they were losing. The flanking maneuver of the zombies through Central Asia had worked, as Europe had let its guard down. The Brazilian front, that for the longest time was at least able to hold, now faltered as well and were pushed south. Russia kept on losing more territory, as did China, whose front crept dangerously close to Mongolia again. Belarus started its clash with the zombies as well, but with the pace that the zombies were heading north, it would not take long before other countries like Latvia and Estonia would join the fray as well. Obama felt the pressure of the world's eyes gazing at the US. He authorized the build of air bases in East America to send aid, reinforcements, and bombers towards Europe. But the clock was ticking. Scandinavia seemingly were the next victim of the undead horde. The fighting was fierce and relentless, many astounded and surprised by the sudden counterattack from the zombies after having been on the winning side for so long. Was it all false hope after all? The initial weeks of fighting in Belarus were a disaster, with the zombies managing to dig their way deep into human territory. In China, the front at former India continued to give way, signaling to neighboring military Myanmar that they would soon find themselves clashing with the zombies as well. And at the Brazilian front, no positive news was issued, as the troops were pushed back, albeit not as aggressively as some other front lines. The soldiers fighting in Belarus had the most difficult time stopping the undead advance. At certain points, here and there, they managed to pull off a victory, but not strong enough to where they could flank or start forcing the enemy eastward. This pushback by the zombies had been the fiercest in years. It looked like new countries would for the first time enter the war on their home turf. Only time would tell if a similar pattern would repeat itself once again, where the humans would be able to dominate the pace. With World War Z changing pace and sides seemingly on its own leisure, the humans were being pushed back on all fronts again. Brazil was being pushed back, as Rwanda and Oman functioned as a buffer zone to keep the flanking zombies at bay. The zombies were still deep into Belarus's territory. The front of the zombies and the border of military Myanmar were getting awfully close. Leader Tan Sui said that though they might not have China's numbers, their soldiers had twice the courage and discipline. As Turkey's troops were being pushed westward, it might not take long before Bulgaria would be thrown into the war again. Boyko Borisov said that his country had continued the military path for the past years and were prepared for an invasion from the south like before. The damage caused by the Tohoku earthquake was so much that the Japanese still had their main forces back in their homeland. For the foreseeable future, they mostly would sit out major confrontations with the undead. At the Russian front, the zombies were once again getting dangerously close to the coast to where they could cut off the troops on two different sides. As Brazil continued to lose ground to the zombies, Leader Cardoso set forth a new training in land doctrines. He said that clearly the old ways were not working, and that hopefully, with these newly instated doctrines, the zombies would be effectively countered. Halfway through November, a Canadian division forwarded a transmission that they could no longer hold the forest area and that the predicted divide would occur within the next month if nothing changed. As most of the zombies in Europe were pushing into the Ukraine and Belarus, a large army of human troops from multiple countries managed to get bypassed and hoped to close the gap to flank the zombies from the rear. And then in December, the divide indeed happened as the armies were being forced west and east due to the water. The attempted flanking maneuver by the bypassed soldiers had failed miserably, as they lost their foothold in less than a month. Though China had lost almost all its territory of former India, the zombies seemed to ignore the south, giving the troops still stationed there the chance to counterattack when opportunity would present itself. The bulk of the horde still headed east, towards military Myanmar and deeper into China itself. In the first week of 2012, Belarus confirmed that they were able to push the zombies back to their original border, as it seemed that on some parts of the front line the pace seemed to change again. Even the feared divide was countered, as several divisions were able to break through and force the zombies away from the shoreline. Brazil at the same time was still unable to win some ground back, but the pacing was not as threatening as elsewhere in Europe and especially Asia. A few zombies now moved southward, deeper into the territory of former India, complicating the retaking for the stationed Chinese soldiers. America once again focused on the election. Obama, who promised the people that he would put an end to the zombie uprising, was not able to fulfill his promise, and some people believed he did not achieve all that much while he was in office. But in the years of Obama, the line did shift to a point where it made a difference which could help Obama through the elections this time to get re-elected, as many felt that Mitt Romney would not do much better. And then at the end of January, a new country was hit at its homeland. Romania yelled for a call to arms as its soldiers needed to defend their country. Leader Emil Constantinescu said his army had prepared in the last half year, and though it might not be enough to face the entire horde, he hoped it would suffice to deal with the flanking zombies along the Romanian line. As Brazil kept on losing territory and was forced westward, Oman saw an opportunity to flank and take former Brazilian-owned territories for themselves. In the first months of fighting, Romania did very poorly, even with the help of Canadian and British troops. In the first week of March, the zombie horde got even closer to military Myanmar, but they had for the moment an alarming low number of soldiers at their border. A few months back, North Korean leader Kim Jong-il had passed away, meaning that now his son, Kim Jong-un, was responsible for the country. One of his first decisions was to increase North Korea's research and science capabilities to hopefully come up with better ways of fighting the zombie. Though the battles in Romania were not in the favor of the humans, a large chunk of the undead had been cut off as the Canadians managed to retake the borderline. The European front was all over the place. As it moved to Asia, it dented southward and upward again, implying a tug-of-war rebound might soon occur once more. And then at the end of May 2012, the battles in military Myanmar started, mostly fought by American and Canadian troops at first. In Romania, the zombies once again managed to head led inward, this time not in a spearheading maneuver, but more spread out. The front at Belarus had shifted eastward, deeper into Russia once more. Though the people felt the tide turning again in that area, Romania was still considered a danger zone, especially as the zombies had reached the northern regions of Bulgaria. The Bulgarians did not have that many units stationed around that zone, as they expected the zombies to come from Turkey's angle. Military Myanmar was now finally able to fight back by using a sneaky maneuver. They claimed land that was previously reclaimed by the Chinese. Romania was growing desperate. They were losing at all sides, even giving the zombies the ability to attack the Ukraine from a southern flanking position. The Bulgarians were able, for the moment, to close the gap and force the undead away from their borders slightly. Romania had lost more than half of its territory already, and with the zombies biting into the Ukrainian once more from the south, the whole eastern front line of the Ukraine and Belarus was faltering again. France's recently elected President François Hollande set forth a naval production. If the zombies managed to fight their way through Europe, France would evacuate most of its political and military high-ranking personnel to Canada. The larger groups of the zombies headed southward, as they could sense they were able to push deeper towards Europe's core. Many countries had layers after layers of troops at the ready to function as a buffer when the undead would try to break through. As Bulgaria had prepared their troops at the wrong side, the zombies managed to spearhead their way southward. Though Bulgaria was far from capitulating, it did create an opening for the undead to attack the Greek soldiers once more on their home turf. But as 2012 drew to a close and America had once more re-elected Obama, Europe's outer ring seemed to waver. But then, just as before, the zombies stopped their advance and were called back, giving the humans the chance to strengthen their front to give them some leadway. The reason for this recurring anomaly was still unknown to the human scientists. The absence of the zombies did not take as long as last time, as in the first days of 2013, the undead had been sighted again all along the border. But in the meantime, military Myanmar and China were able to retake much of their stolen land. Armor development over the past years had increased dramatically, hopefully giving the humans a better edge at dominating the pace of the battles. It would not be until 2018 before a new prototype of tank would be ushered in. The death toll of the zombies stood at 140 million, with many more roaming the fields. They walked throughout a bombed-out, hellish wasteland where life went extinct and mutations due to the radiation started to occur. The European front was right back where it started, and the same counted for the line headed towards Finland. A zombie stalemate was upon the world. The tug-of-war effect resulted in no side bleeding out, but losses were felt all over. If it would depend on technology, it would mean that the war would still be going on for at least 4 to 5 years before a breakthrough could be made. Oman, just like Brazil before that, was not able to hold the front line, meaning they were being pushed back deeper into their own territory. As their troops retreated, the Chinese troops advanced, coherent with the tug-of-war fashion. The few leftovers by Brazil were being attacked as well, not able to fend for themselves that effectively. And for months onward, the same pacing was kept, except in China, where the advancement by the southern soldiers was countered to where they almost lost all of the territory they held. In the third month of 2014, The soldiers in Oman were able to pick up the pace and determine some victories for their side, as did, surprisingly, Rwanda. Over half of former India had been reclaimed by the Chinese, mostly due to Russian troops attacking from the northeast. The soil had been poisoned by so much war, death, and disease that life in these parts was unthinkable for the foreseeable future. Mongolia